subspecialty of pathology.
That portion of the admitted exhibit. And then with regard to the state's identified exhibits, those will be admitted as well. Any other preliminary matters that we need to address before getting back into evidence on behalf of the applicant?
No, Your Honor.
Anything on behalf of the state?
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right. You may call your first witness then.
Thank you, Your Honor. We call Dr. Jennifer Hammmers.
Good morning, doctor. Take your time, come forward and have a seat in the chair to my left. Yep, go ahead and have a seat. If you'd raise your right hand. You've been called as a witness. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give will be true and correct?
I do.
Okay, and then there's a microphone in front of you, a bottom button in the center. Perfect. And then you can adjust the chair and the microphone so that you can sit comfortably.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Thompson, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Hammmers.
Good morning.
Can you please introduce yourself to the court?
Sure. My name is Jennifer Hammmers, Jennifer Hammers.
Were you retained as an expert by attorneys for Todd Mullis in this case?
Yes, I was.
And are you here this morning to offer opinions about your evaluation and work in this case?
Yes, I am.
We'll get to that in a minute, but I want to start by asking you about your background and experience. What is your current profession, Dr. Hammmers?
I am a forensic pathologist.
Briefly, what is forensic pathology?
Forensic pathology is a subspecialty of pathology, which is a specialized area of medicine that specifically focuses on the investigation and determination of cause and manner of death, primarily for decedents who die suddenly or unexpectedly.
Where is your practice based out of?
It's based out of Western Pennsylvania, so in the Pittsburgh area.
Do you currently work as a forensic pathologist for any governmental entities?
My business holds contracts with different counties, which are governmental entities, to perform autopsies for their counties.
Why do those counties have contracts with you to perform those autopsies?
So they're small counties that aren't large enough to have their own medical examiner system, like there are in many larger cities and states. And so those small counties will contract with forensic pathologists to perform their autopsies, because the coroners who are responsible for the investigation are not typically physicians or even are not typically forensic pathologists or even physicians.
Do you perform the same services for those counties that a medical examiner would in a larger county?
Yes, I do.
In your capacity with your contracts with those counties, do you work with police and law enforcement at all?
I do.
And what do you do in that capacity with law enforcement?
I get information from law enforcement about their investigation. I'll get reconstruction reports if the police do accident reconstruction, and depending on the county, there will be detectives or police who will show up to observe the autopsy, take photos from the autopsy, or collect evidence.
I want to come back to your current employment in a minute, but let's talk briefly about your education. Are you a medical school graduate?
I am.
What degree do you have?
I have a DO, or a Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine.
Is that different from an MD?
The medical training is the same. There's some additional training in osteopathic manipulation that osteopathic physicians get, but essentially the basics of the medical education and the time that it takes to become a physician and the training is the same.
After graduation, did you do a residency?
Yes, I did.
For how long?
For 4 years.
And after your residency, did you do a fellowship?
Yes.
Where?
I did my forensic fellowship at the New York City Medical Examiner's Office, based in Manhattan, and I stayed there for a second year of fellowship, specifically focused on forensic neuropathology and cardiac pathology.
What did you do during your fellowship?
So I performed autopsies primarily. I testified in court to my findings. And in my second year, I served on the consultant service to examine hearts and brains that were saved from our forensic cases. During that year, I also continued to perform autopsies.
While you were performing your fellowship in New York, were the autopsies that you were performing only on people who had been residents of New York City before they died?
No, the jurisdiction, the law indicates that anybody who dies within the city, it's the responsibility of the medical examiner to investigate and determine the cause and manner of death. So that included tourists, people who were brought into hospitals in New York City from other states or other counties. Those all fell under our jurisdiction.
In addition to things that for you would be typical autopsies, did you perform any autopsies involving atypical deaths?
Yes, certainly.
Can you give me some examples?
Sure. We had deaths that were unusual because of being in a city. We had people who jumped off of buildings and bridges and would be injured by objects on the ground or close to the ground. We had, because of the nature of the medical centers there, we had people from rural areas that either had work-related accidents, industrial accidents, that would be brought into the city.
When your fellowship was over in New York City, where did you go?
I took a job as a medical examiner in Boston, Massachusetts, working for the Commonwealth.
And what geographic area did your work in that office cover?
So we covered all the cases from the Boston area, but we also received cases from the entire Commonwealth, so all the way to the western border.
And just like in New York City, what kinds of cases did you see while you were there that might be different from more typical cases?
So certainly a lot of water-related deaths. We had an increase in rural deaths, so vehicular accidents, farming accidents, accidents, in the woods while skiing on a mountain, those types of things.
After your time in Boston, where did you go next?
I moved back to New York City. I was invited to come back and work there, so I went back to the New York City Medical Examiner's office and worked for 4 years.
Did you have any particular responsibilities during those 4 years in New York?
So in addition to doing autopsies again, for the first 2 years, I was the fellowship program director for the 2 programs that I had graduated from. And so that meant that I was responsible for training and helping maintain the accreditation for that program. So I did a lot of teaching of the fellows during those 2 years that I was in Manhattan. The second 2 years I moved to Brooklyn and I was the deputy chief medical examiner of the Kings County facility, which covered cases for Staten Island and Brooklyn. And in that role, I basically was in charge of running that office, the day-to-day operations. There were 7 other medical examiners that worked with me. The fellows rotated. We had medical students from primarily from Downstate University. And then a staff of about 40 people. So I ran that office and then was part of the City Medical Examiner's executive team, which made decisions about hiring, budgets, running the DNA lab, running all of the offices and the training programs.
For those jobs that you had in Boston and New York, did you testify in court?
Yes, I did.
And did you testify in cases where your conclusion was that the death involved was a homicide?
Yes.
Did you testify in cases where you drew other conclusions?
Yes.
What did you do after your time in New York?
So I was looking for a job or evaluating jobs as a chief medical examiner and ultimately was offered a position in a private practice in Pittsburgh with Dr. Cyril Wecht. So I accepted that position and moved to Pittsburgh to work with him in his private practice to help him perform autopsies.
Is Dr. Wecht still alive?
No, unfortunately, he passed away just about a year ago.
And what was your job with Dr. Wecht?
So my job was to work for his practice. I primarily performed autopsies, completed autopsy reports, and testified in court to those findings.
Did you ultimately leave Dr. Weck's practice?
I did.
When did you do that?
In November of 2022.
And what did you do next?
So in November of 2022, I started working for myself full-time. And so I had already been performing per diem autopsies for other counties that needed help or when people were on vacation. And I had my own medical legal consulting cases that I worked on. So I just transitioned into doing that full-time.
And why did you do that?
I felt like after, almost 10 years working for the government and 5 years of working for Dr. Wecht at 15 years of experience, I had always wanted to either run an office or work for myself, and I felt like that was a good time for me to do that.
How many employees does your business have now?
We have, between full-time and part-time people who work with us, 14 people.
You told us earlier that you hold contracts to perform autopsies for various counties in Pennsylvania. Is that right?
Yes.
What percentage of your time in your current practice is spent doing work for those counties?
I would say probably about 60 to 70%.
And in terms of the demographics of those counties, are they rural or urban or suburban, or what is their makeup?
They're primarily rural, with one county having some small areas that are, I would consider, a little more suburban.
For the autopsies that you've performed for those rural counties, what kinds of injuries are you seeing at autopsy?
The whole variety. We see the typical cases that medical examiners see, like, motor vehicle crashes and gunshot wounds, but we see a lot of deaths in more rural areas, like people on dirt bikes or ATVs, farms, people at work who are passing away, those types of cases.
In your current practice, do you testify in court?
I do.
And have you testified on cases in your current practice where your opinion has been that the manner of death was a homicide?
Yes.
All right, you said that I think you said 60 to 70% of your current practice is with those counties, is that right?
Yes.
What else are you doing with the rest of your professional time currently?
So I participate in medical legal consultations, like I've done on this case, and a large amount of that other time is spent teaching and as the pathology division chief at the Duquesne University College of Osteopathic Medicine.
I want to come back to your teaching in a minute, but you mentioned that you do consulting work. Can you explain what a consulting forensic pathologist does?
Sure. So primarily we're asked to review records. Typically it's cases where either a living or decedent person has had evaluations, and I'm given either medical records, autopsy reports, photographs, investigative information, and I'm asked to review that, analyze that, and offer independent opinions based off of my review.
Who are the clients that retain you for those consultations?
Attorneys do.
In what kinds of cases?
All kinds of cases. I've consulted in civil cases. I've consulted in criminal cases, both for the prosecution and the defense, Title IX cases, on college campuses, arbitrations, living victims of things like strangulation, so a whole variety.
And are you retained more often for one side or the other in those consults?
I would say for the consultations, it's probably about 50-50.
And have you been called to consult on criminal cases as well as civil cases?
Yes, I have.
In some of those consults, are you performing an autopsy?
I'm sorry, what did you ask me?
Sure. For some of the cases that you're consulting on, have you been asked to perform an autopsy?
Occasionally. It's uncommon, but yes.
And for those cases where you're not performing an autopsy, but you're consulting, do you follow a different procedure in terms of the way that you evaluate the case?
No, I follow the same procedure.
Well, if you're not performing an autopsy, how are you able to get information to aid in your evaluation?
Well, I'm using the autopsy and the information that's documented in the report, in the photos, in their investigative reports, and reviewing that and drawing my own conclusions from that, and then placing that autopsy into the context of all of the other information that's available, just like I would do if I performed the autopsy.
As a consulting pathologist, do you have clients who retain you to provide opinions in a case who elect ultimately not to use those opinions?
Yes. So my opinions are my opinions. If they choose to use them, they may. If not, then they may not.
Is it a concern for you if a client elects not to use your opinions?
No, it's not.
All right. You mentioned that you teach, and in addition to your work with Duquesne University, are you teaching anywhere else currently?
I teach at Duquesne University in 2 other programs other than the medical school, in the Masters of Forensic Science and Law program, and at the law school at Duquesne. And then I teach a course at Boston University in their Masters of Anthropology program.
Have you presented and published on topics in forensic pathology?
Yes,
Are you a licensed physician?
I am.
In what states?
Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, and California.
Are you board certified in any subjects?
Yes.
What subjects?
Anatomic and clinical pathology and forensic pathology.
Are you a member of any forensic pathology professional societies?
I am.
What societies?
I'm a member of our 2 national societies, the National Association of Medical Examiners and the American Academy of Forensic Sciences.
Do you hold any leadership or committee positions in forensic pathology?
I do.
And can you tell me about any of those?
Sure. So I am part of the American Board of Pathology's test development review committee for our continuing certification, which are questions that we have to answer quarterly in order to maintain our license. So on that committee, we review questions, we edit them, we update them, make sure they're current, look at feedback from the test takers, and consider that. I also am part of the ACGME, which is the Graduate Medical Education Council, which certifies our training programs in pathology. So both in primary pathology, anatomic and clinical, and all of the subspecialties. So we review those programs annually and issue citations if programs are non-compliant with the requirements.
In total, Dr. Hammmers, at this point in your career, how many autopsies have you performed?
Probably just under about 6,000.
Have you been qualified as an expert in forensic pathology in the past?
Yes, I have.
Has a court ever determined that you were not qualified as a forensic pathologist?
No, it is not.
In your career with teaching, have you been involved in running any teachings or trainings for law enforcement?
I have.
And can you tell me what that has been?
Sure. So for the last probably 5 or so years, I've taught for the Pennsylvania State Police, who put on a basic homicide, advanced homicide, and cold case lecture series or educational series. There's probably about a total of 5 of those trainings a year between the 3 of them, and I lecture in all 3 of them.
At this point, Your Honor, we're seeking to qualify Dr. Hammmers as an expert in the field of forensic pathology.
Does the state desire any additional record?
No, Your Honor. I don't think this is necessary under Iowa law. She's qualified by her testimony, her opinions. There's no requirement that the court make that finding.
I agree. Certainly, I agree that this witness qualifies as an expert.
I'll proceed, Your Honor. Thank you. Are the opinions that you're going to offer in your testimony today, Dr. Hammmers, opinions that you hold to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes, they are.
And the opinions that you're going to testify about today are those opinions you reached using techniques that are generally accepted in the field of forensic pathology?
Yes.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 276. And just so the court's aware while that's being pulled up, Your Honor, I don't think for this exhibit, but for other exhibits that have been admitted today, we do intend to publish those to the gallery today.
Just let me know, I guess, counsel, if there's one that you would like
Thank
put
you,
up on the big screen.
Thank you. Do you see Exhibit 276 in front of you, Dr. Hammmers?
I do.
And if you need to look through it to answer this question, please let us know. But is this a true and accurate copy of your CV and the report that you issued about your opinions in this case?
I only see the cover sheet of my CV.
If you'll look, we'll move through that for you.
Can you go just a little bit slower because it's all gray? That's okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
Have you had a chance to look at Exhibit 276?
Yes, sorry, it came back to the CV again. So
All right.
yes, I see.
Is that a true and accurate copy of your report in this case and your CV?
It does appear to be, yes.
All right, and Your Honor, at this point, we're seeking to admit into evidence Exhibit 276.
Judge, if I may, sorry.
Yep, any other?
276 in the CV, we have no objection to that portion of it. The report that Dr. Hammmers authored, which I think is dated March 10th of 2023, correct?
I believe so.
Is hearsay, since it was prepared in preparation for litigation, is not admissible. I believe there's also some affidavits that are attached to it that are likewise hearsay as well. So that's our objection.
The court will take those objections under advisement, and we'll move forward since this is a bench trial. You may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. And I have a binder for the witness of Exhibit 276 and two other reports that I think we've conferred about and may seek to offer into evidence, but not at this time. I just want the witness to have them available for her testimony. So we'll provide that notebook to her.
Okay, Mr. Brown, did you want to review whatever this is that the witness is going to have available to
So I
her?
was provided a copy of that before
Okay.
we came in, and I know we've already discussed this issue back in chambers. We are going to have an objection to the two other reports that are contained in that binder for the reasons we stated in chambers. And just for the record, this is in the two cases that we gave the court, or three, was In Re Stencil, 827 Northwest 2nd, 690, 2013 Iowa Supreme Court case, which also references two other cases, State versus Barrett, 445 Northwest 2nd, 749, an Iowa Supreme Court case from 1989, and Bruner versus Brown, 480 Northwest 2nd, 33, Iowa Supreme Court case from 1992. Our objection would be to those reports and the consideration of those by the witness, in as much as they're going to use them in this way, just to alert the court to this. The expert here is, as State versus Barrett says, does not empower one expert witness to state other experts also subscribe to the same conclusion. Essentially, what we believe this is going to be is vouching. It also is the same 5.703, which is the rule of evidence. I believe that they're going to be relying on is not intended to be a mechanism for experts to self-bolster their own opinions with the opinions of other experts. That's Bruner versus Brown, the case I just cited. So I realize the court may take all of this information subject to that objection, but in as much as she relies on that, where it crosses this line that clearly Iowa's case law indicates that she cannot cross, we would ask the court to certainly consider our objection under those circumstances.
Ms. Thompson, did you wish to make any additional record on this point at this time?
I was going to say I'd like to reserve argument on this issue, Your Honor.
Okay, and that's fine. Obviously, I don't know how the testimony is going to come in yet. I understand that this may be an issue as it does, and certainly I'll allow both parties to make arguments they wish. You may proceed at this point, Ms. Thompson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Hammmers, you mentioned earlier that you were retained by Mr. Mullis's counsel to review materials related to this case and offer your opinions. What specifically were you asked to do?
I was asked to review multiple pieces of information, review them, analyze them, and offer opinions concerning my review based off of my education, training, and experience.
All right. Now, you did not conduct an autopsy of Ms. Mullis in this case, is that right?
That's correct, I did not.
All right. Did the fact that you are not a person who conducted an autopsy in this case limit your ability to reach opinions about her death or about the pattern of her injuries?
It does not.
Why not?
I'm able to review Dr. Cruz's autopsy report, the photographs that she had taken, the toxicology report, the medical records, EMS records, and the photographs that Dr. Thompson had taken at the hospital, and analyze all of those just like I would if I was doing the autopsy and preparing to sign a death certificate, and be able to issue opinions based off of that.
Did your process in evaluating Ms. Mullis's death differ from the process you'd follow in cases where you did perform the autopsy?
My process did not, no.
In general terms, what sources of information did you rely on to evaluate Ms. Mullis's death?
So I had the autopsy report, photographs, toxicology report. I had medical records from Ms. Mullis's hospital visit on the 6th of November, as well as when she came to the hospital the day that she passed away. I had the investigative reports from the police documenting the events the day that she passed away. I had Dr. Thompson's information from the hospital, as well as his photographs. I additionally received a report that Dr. Wecht had issued and a report that Dr. Boley had issued regarding their review of the case as well.
Now, you mentioned that Ms. Mullis had gone to the hospital on November 6th. How close in time was that to her going to the hospital related to her injuries in this case?
So it was about 4 days.
What was your understanding of why she went to the hospital that day?
She had a medical procedure that was like a same-day procedure that she underwent on that day.
What was that procedure?
It was what's called a DNC, or dilatation and curettage. It's a procedure on the uterus that can assist if someone is having continued uterine bleeding.
Was Ms. Mullis having that problem?
Yes, that's why she presented.
Why did you want to review records related to that procedure in this case?
Well, especially with it being so close in time to her passing away, I noticed that there had been some reports that the day that she passed away that she had some complaints of feeling tired, maybe being kind of dizzy, and she had just kind of started back to working on the farm that day after the procedure because she hadn't been feeling well. And so it's best practice to have a person's medical information in general, but certainly if they have a procedure or some kind of medical history around the time that they die, it's good to know what procedure they had, any medications they were on, and anything that was documented at the hospital during that time.
As part of your the records that you reviewed in this case, did you review any records from the emergency medical services staff who provided assistance to Ms. Mullis on her way to the hospital?
Yes, I did.
Did you review the Greeley Fire Department pre-hospital care report?
Yes.
Why did you look at the EMS records?
So my standard practice and everywhere that I've worked is that when I know that there are pre-hospital records from EMS or fire first responders, is to get information from those records, either to have an investigator gather that information and have it in our report prior to autopsy, or to gather just the records themselves and be able to review them to understand what medical procedures were done and what their observations were, because findings and observations can change over the course of time prior to autopsy. So it's nice to have those different steps to be able to analyze each person's view of what they saw and what they did along the way.
And you said that you also reviewed medical records from Ms. Mullis being brought to the hospital where she passed away?
Yes, I did.
And why did you review those records?
So to understand, was her condition the same when EMS saw her as when she came to the hospital? Did anything change? Did they do any kind of additional testing that would help understand why she's passing away? Did they make any observations that either weren't present at autopsy or were different than autopsy and different than what Dr. Thompson, his photographs and his report showed?
Reviewing these categories of records, prior medical care, EMS records, medical care from the day that she passed, is review of those kinds of records part of the general practices of forensic pathologists reaching cause and manner of death determinations?
Yes. So in my training, in every place I've worked, and in all of my understanding of forensic pathology practice, that is part of the process and is the beginning part of the process even prior to autopsy.
And it is the general practice of forensic pathologists to review those records before reaching opinions about cause and manner of death?
Yes.
Did you review any records or photographs from the Delaware County Sheriff's Office in this case?
Yes, I did.
What did you review?
There were some, I think, two specific accounts of deputies. I think they're deputies. I'm sorry if I'm stating that, but who had responded at the scene and had gone to the farm and in the shed and taken photographs.
Did you rely only on those materials to gain an understanding of the shed or issues related to the Mullis farm?
No, not just those.
What else did you do?
So I went and visited the farm and the shed to see the space for myself.
Is that a common practice for forensic pathologists?
I would say that it's not common for a forensic pathologist to go to every scene, but certainly we can choose to go to any scene that we would like to. And in cases where there's a question of in my experience, it tends to be a question of determining the manner of death that I've gone to scenes, but it could be the cause of death as well. And if you just don't have sort of what you need from the photos or the investigative report, or you need to kind of see, could this happen in the way that it's being posed to me or the way that I think it may have happened from the autopsy, it can be helpful to go to the scene.
Is gaining an understanding of the scene, whether through records review or a forensic pathologist's own investigation, is that a generally accepted practice in the field of forensic pathology?
It is. Typically, the only time that there isn't a scene investigation is if somebody dies at the hospital, but that would tend to be like if they're dying under natural causes. If there are unnatural causes, then certainly going back to the scene, depending on the circumstances, would be something that would be quite common for the investigators at the office, at least, to go and do.
Now, you referenced as part of your evaluation in this case, reaching determinations about the cause and manner of Ms. Mullis's death.
Yes.
Is that a determination you've made in this case?
Yes.
Before we get to what your determinations are, what process did you follow to reach your opinions in this case?
So I would say that in this case and every case, I follow sort of a standard like scientific method to the process that I undergo in order to evaluate a death.
What does that process generally?
So basically, it is gathering the beginning information that we've talked about, like the circumstances of death, the first responders, some medical information prior to the autopsy, at the autopsy performing the external exam or looking at the outside of the body, and collecting any evidence or pictures, things like that that we need. And from there, formulating some ideas or hypothesis about what the cause and manner of death likely is, and then taking those into the autopsy, performing the autopsy, collecting additional samples like for toxicology or to look under the microscope at different tissues, and kind of testing those hypotheses of what we believe may be the likely cause and manner of death, and then waiting for the additional testing to come back, like the toxicology report, and then reevaluating those hypotheses of the cause and manner of death, and then ultimately, if we need more information at that point, going back and asking for it in order to make sure that we have everything we need to issue the cause and manner of death, and that there isn't anything outstanding that could be an important factor to that. And so when we get to that point, that's when we're going to issue the cause and manner of death and issue the death certificate.
All right, and Dr. Hammmers, you described at the point where you've conducted the external exam and an autopsy, that being the point where you develop your hypotheses. In your practice of developing cause and manner of death determinations, are there cases where after the external examination of the body at autopsy, you make a determination of your opinions about cause and manner of death?
So after my external exam, I often have a pretty, depending on the case, I can have a pretty good idea of what is happening depending on what injuries I see on the body or what I don't see. But I always need the internal examination to be able to definitively examine those tissues inside and understand. So a good example would be, I might see a gunshot wound that's in the chest. I can tell that it went in and it went out, but I won't know how much bleeding is inside the chest. I won't know what organs necessarily that it struck without doing the internal exam. So knowing basic anatomy, I could come up with some presumptions of what likely happened, but I wouldn't know until I actually did the autopsy. And the autopsy is typically what allows you to better understand the mechanism of somebody's death or the physiologic changes that are happening to them.
All right. So as part of your review of this case, did you have materials in front of you that would let you conduct an external review of Ms. Mullis's injuries?
Yes.
And just before we start to talk about this, do people in your field sometimes use the word defect in talking about injuries?
Yes.
What does defect mean in that context?
Defect tends to be used as like an injury or a hole that you can see in either the skin or an organ, and typically it's used when you're not really sure what it's from. So you may say this is a defect, and then ultimately you come to a more specific conclusion that it's a gunshot wound defect or a stab wound defect, and you may call it then an injury. So defect tends to be a general term when we're not sure or we're not yet sure more specifically what caused it.
All right. In your review of Ms. Mullis's body in this case, did you determine that areas of her body had injuries?
Yes.
Where were her injuries?
So she had puncture types of injuries on her back and extending over to her back right side, and then she had blunt type of injuries on different parts of her body.
And we're going to talk about both of those injuries, or both of those types of injuries, but just in general, thinking about, in your evaluation of both the injuries to her back and the injuries to other areas of her body, did you consider both of those categories of injuries in reaching your opinion?
I did.
Was there one category that was more significant than another?
Yes.
And which was more significant?
So the puncture defects that were on her back and extending to her right side were ultimately the significant injuries that she had.
Your Honor, at this point, I want to show the witness and publish to the gallery Exhibit 573, which has been admitted into evidence. And this is a version of that exhibit which has been cropped somewhat for privacy reasons, which I think the state saw yesterday.
Kelly, do you see the remotes for the big TVs anywhere here?
I don't see them.
Oh, it's on. Just need to wake up, I guess.
Do you have the exhibit in front of you, Dr. Hammmers?
I do.
What are we looking at here in Exhibit 573?
So this is a photograph of Miss Mullis's back, particularly looking at it from the right side. In the upper right, you can see the back of her, where her arm meets her shoulder, so like the back of the armpit area. And there are 6 puncture defects that are on her right backside, extending across her back. And amongst some of those, there's one abrasion or scraping type of injury to the skin.
Are you familiar with a term, wound pattern analysis?
Yes.
What is that?
That's essentially when you look at each individual wound and look at any specific features like the size, the shape, the orientation, and the features around the wound. And then when you take all of the wounds that you have and look at them for any kind of patterns that they might have, or similarities or differences that they might have, to try to group some or all of the injuries together to understand how someone may have sustained those injuries.
Did you do that type of analysis on the injuries that, on Ms. Mullis's body?
Yes, I did.
And first of all, in general terms, how would you describe the injuries that we're seeing in Exhibit 573?
So all of the injuries but that small scrape to the skin are all puncture types of defects or penetrating defects, meaning that the injury is going deeper into the body than it is large on the surface of the skin.
Can you give me an example of something that would be a penetrating defect?
So common things that we see that are penetrating defects would be things like gunshot wounds and stab wounds.
All right. Those aren't the only types of penetrating defects, I take it?
No, there's multiple other types of objects that can cause penetrating defects, but those are the most common that we see.
All right. In this case, you've reviewed Dr. Cruz's reports, and you reviewed prior testimony from Dr. Cruz as well. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
In Dr. Cruz's analysis or Dr. Cruz's testimony about this case, did she assign letters to various of these wounds?
Yes, she did.
All right. And have you adopted those letters in your analysis?
Yes.
Which letters have been assigned to which of these wounds in this case?
So she labeled them letters A through F. 6 wounds lettered A through F, and she started on the right side, which is the right side of this picture, with A, and then moving across the body, B and C. And then D she labeled as the lowest wound, and then E and F traveling upward.
To make sure that I understand, wound A is on the right side of the picture under her armpit, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And do you see a wound that is up from the ruler, but sort of at the end of the ruler?
Yes.
What, is that B?
That is B, correct.
All right, then in the middle of the photograph, I get, well, more on the left side of the photograph, but in line with B, do you see 3 injuries and a line?
Yes.
Okay, so the injury that has the line, that's what you described as an abrasion, is that right?
That's correct.
The injury that is below that abrasion, which number, or which letter is that?
That was wound D.
All right, and then above wound D, there are 2 injuries right there?
Yes.
And which is on the right?
C is on the right and E is on the left.
All right, and then there's another injury that's more to the top left-hand corner of the photo?
Yes.
What's that?
That Dr. Cruz labeled as F.
Right. Are any of these wounds, A through F, different from other wounds in the pattern?
They all are penetrating injuries, but some of them are just looking at them without adjusting them or moving the skin or examining them further. Some of them are larger than other ones, and some of them are a little bit smaller.
Which are larger?
Wounds A and B are the largest, with wound A being the larger of the 2. And then wounds E and F are slightly larger than C and D.
And when you're talking about being larger or smaller in this context, are you talking about depth or circumference, or what are you referencing?
So just looking at the skin here, the differences that you can see are going to be in the somewhat the size and shape of the actual defect in the skin or the hole in the skin, and then the skin around that defect that has some changes where you can see discoloration, which is abrasion and contusion or scraping and bleeding.
Looking at well, in general with these wounds, did any of them have exit wounds on Miss Mullis's body that were associated with them?
So wound A had an injury on the front right breast that was in line with all of the injury path that was ultimately described on the internal examination, and was the end point of that injury path.
You mentioned earlier in your testimony that it's important to that part of your analysis is to look at medical records or records of treatment from different periods of time to gain an understanding of treatment over time. In that context, can the appearance of injuries on someone's body change over time?
Yes, they can.
And can you explain why that's the case?
Sure. So anytime the skin is broken or damaged, it makes the skin go from dry to having moisture, and anytime there's moisture on the skin or on an injury, that area is subject to drying, and that can change the color, the extent, and some of the features of the wounds.
I think we've identified which of these wounds have which letter. And I think it's your testimony that these wounds had different depths, is that right?
I did not testify to that, but they did have different depths, yes.
And sorry, I want to go through and talk about the depths of these wounds, so let's start there. So for wound A, the wound on the right, how deep was that wound?
Off the top of my head, my recollection was that was about 6.5 inches deep.
And what about wound B, the next wound over?
That one was not quite as deep. I believe it was about 6 inches. And I don't know if you want me to look at the autopsy report or not, just to make sure that I'm giving you the accurate measurements.
Let me ask you this. Did you review records from Dr. Cruz where she noted measurements of the depths of these wounds at the autopsy?
Yes, in her notes and at the autopsy, she had these documented, the size, the features surrounding the wounds, the depths of the wounds, and the measurements between the wounds and the orientation of them.
And before we talk a little more about depth, let me ask you this. Just looking at the external appearance of these wounds, the way that you see them in Exhibit 573, for you as a forensic pathologist, can you draw any conclusions about a situation where you have a pattern of wounds where some of them have different appearance than the others?
Yes, I mean, I can come up with possibilities.
And what are some possibilities for why that might be the case?
So it could be that there is movement of an object while it's in the body, which can extend the size and change some of the features around of the surrounding skin. And it can be that there are more shallow or deeper depths of penetration with an object, which can change the appearance slightly. So if you presume that it's the same object causing all of the injuries, you could explain differences in them based off of movement and the depth of the penetration.
All right, and you mentioned that you think that the concept of movement is relevant to considering the pattern of injuries. Is that right?
Yes.
How does it impact your analysis of injuries to think about the body as something that moves?
So it can change two things. So if an object, thinking about an object penetrating the body and being in the body while there's movement, that can change the size and features of the wound itself. But then looking at the body as a whole and knowing that particularly this part of the body, the torso or the chest, back, and abdomen is highly movable, it allows me to know that there can be a movement of the location of the body either closer together or further apart based off of the position that the person's body is in at the time that they're sustaining the injuries.
You mentioned earlier that having access to the measurements of the depths would aid in your testimony. And let me ask you first, in addition to looking at measurements from Dr. Cruz of the depths of these wounds, did you have access to measurements that Dr. Cruz took of the distance between the wounds?
Yes, she had those in her notes, and she had, I think, all but one of them from her notes were in her autopsy report as well.
And was that information you took into account in your analysis?
Yes, it was.
Why?
Because understanding that information aids in understanding and coming to conclusions about how this set of injuries might have been sustained.
Would looking at a demonstrative of the photographs of Ms. Mullis's wounds with some of those distances noted on it, would that aid in your testimony?
Yes.
All right, at this point, Your Honor, I'm going to show the witness a demonstrative, which we provided to the state to aid in the witness's testimony.
And as I understand it, that's been reviewed and there's no objection, is that correct?
Yeah, correct, Judge. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Are you able to see the demonstrative in front of you, Dr. Hammmers?
Yes, I am.
And what is the demonstrative that you're looking at show?
So this shows the injuries that we just saw in the previous picture, similar orientation and view, but has added colored lines and measurements between the wounds, kind of in a order from A to B, B to C, C to D, etc. And it shows the measurements that Dr. Cruz made and documented of the distances between those wounds that are the actual numbers in inches.
Just one moment, Your Honor. Thank you, Your Honor. I'm going to show the witness a slightly different demonstrative, which I believe the state has also seen. Dr. Hammmers, what does the demonstrative in front of you show?
So this is an image that shows wounds B through F, as well as that small abrasion. You're not able to see wound A on this picture because it's a little more toward the right side, but this is a more straight-on picture of Miss Mullis's back, showing 5 of the 6 injuries, showing those lines again between the injuries with the measurements that Dr. Cruz took. But this time it also, next to the large black letter that is the wound that Dr. Cruz designated and that we've kept for this discussion, it shows the size of the wound as she measured it in parenthesis, and then the depth of the wound, meaning how far or long into the body that she measured the path of the injury going.
And so does looking at this diagram help you tell us, help you review for us what the depths of these various wounds were?
Yes.
Can you, I understand we can't see wound A on here, and we'll get to that in a minute, but can you tell us what the relative depths of wounds B through F were on Miss Mullis's back?
Sure. So wound B went 6.5 inches deep. Wound C went 3 3/4 of an inch deep. Wound D went 2 inches deep, and wound E was 6 1/2 inches deep, and wound F was 3 3/4 of an inch deep.
So B and E are the deepest wounds?
Of these 5, yes, those are the 2 deepest wounds.
All right, and which is the shallowest wound?
Wound D at 2 inches was the most shallow.
As an aside, I mean, looking at the measurements here between the wounds, for instance, did Dr. Cruz mention that the distance between wound B and wound C was 3 inches?
Yes, she did.
Does that mean that if wounds B and C were sustained at the same time, that they were 3 inches apart at the time an injury was sustained?
They may have been, but not necessarily based off of the position of Miss Mullis's body.
And can you explain why the position would impact that?
Sure. So with the torso and specifically the back, a person is able to either hyperflex or hyperextend. So in hyperflexion, they would be kind of like pulled forward with their shoulders forward, maybe bent forward, and hyperextended, they would be back, like with their shoulders back, their back arched, maybe their neck back, or even twisted, bent to the side or rotated to the side. And so those positions are going to change the distance, the actual distance at the time of the injury between those 2 injuries. So it could be that the injuries were sustained with the body at 3 inches apart, or it could have been closer or further away.
Does the fact that someone's back, as you've described, can move and twist, does that mean that it's not possible to draw conclusions about the pattern of the wound, given that those distances might change?
No, you can still make some hypothesis or draw similarities from the wounds, both from all of the measurements that we've talked about so far.
All right, I'm going to show you an additional diagram. I'm going to show you an additional diagram that adds in wound A to these measurements. Would that aid in your testimony?
Yes.
All right. Is what you're looking at in this demonstrative, the picture we've been looking at with measurements of wounds B through F, with some measurements between wound A and B added?
Yes.
And where wound A on the left side would be under Miss Mullis's armpit in an area that's between her side and her armpit, correct?
Correct.
And that's what's depicted on the other photo?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell us what the depth of wound A was?
So the depth of wound A was 6 inches.
All right. And what was the relative distance between wound A and wound B?
It was 4.5 inches.
and I want to make sure that what I said was clear. I think I may have said that wound A was on the left side. Would wound A have been to the right of wound B on this picture we're looking at on the left side of the left of the two photographs?
Yes, in the left of the two photographs, the wound A would have been toward the right, kind of between the side of the body and the arm.
As part of your, as a forensic pathologist, as part of your evaluation of injuries, are you trying to think through the position that a body might have been at the time that a certain pattern of injuries occurred?
Yes, so part of my analysis, if I have no indication of what may have caused these injuries, would be to think of them individually or as a group or groups to try to come up with an idea of what type of object or instrument could have caused this. And then if an instrument is posed to me as either known to or likely to have caused those injuries, I would then analyze the injuries with that object in mind, trying to understand if it's possible to have this injury, set of injuries caused by that object.
All right, in this case, the materials you've been provided indicate that there was an object called a corn rake that was involved in these injuries?
Yes.
Did you, as part of your analysis, have an opportunity to examine the corn rake at issue in this case?
I saw photographs of the corn rake.
In your mind, based on everything that you reviewed, is there any question that wounds A through F were caused by Ms. Mullis's body coming in contact with that corn rake in some way?
From looking at the injuries and from all of the information that I reviewed, the injuries are consistent with that, and I did not see anything where that was debated that was the object that caused these injuries.
Thinking about the corn rake that we're talking about, do you know what the distance between the tines of that corn rake are?
So the distance between the tines is just shy of 3 inches, so it's almost 3 inches.
How do you have that number?
From a photograph.
Given, so in your analysis, understanding that the object at issue here is this corn rake and that you have these injuries on Ms. Mullis's back, in your opinion, is there a pattern to the injuries on Ms. Mullis's back that we're looking at?
There is, yes.
And what is your opinion about what that pattern is?
My opinion is that there's 3 injuries that you can cluster together that have similar features, which is A, B, and C. There's 2 injuries that have similar features, E and F, that you can cluster together, and then there is wound D, which is kind of on its own and a little bit separate in its orientation and features.
How are you able to determine that A, B, and C are sort of one set of connected injuries?
So looking at the spacing between them, so the wounds B and C has a 3-inch length between them, and wounds A and B is 4.5 inches. That 4.5 inches is over a curved part of the body, however. So in reality, a more narrow object could make both of those injuries at the same time if it's penetrating the body, particularly at an angle. And they also have a similar orientation of the wounds themselves if you face them on like the face of a clock. So they're all going in, all 3 of them are in the same orientation that way.
And so when you say they're in the same orientation, explain to me what you mean by that.
So when we describe injuries, we can describe them using the face of a clock. So if something is straight up and down, so in orientation with the head and the feet would be straight up and down, that's vertical. You could describe that as vertical, or you could describe it as 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock. If something is across the body from left to right, like straight across, you could describe that as transverse or horizontal. But putting it on the face of the clock, you could use 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock. And then anything else would be oblique. and you could place it on the face of a clock using, 2 o'clock and 7 o'clock, for example. And so looking at these 3 injuries, they had a similar oblique orientation on the face of a clock that Dr. Cruz documented in her autopsy report.
Is your opinion about the orientation of Ms. Mullis's wounds different from Dr. Cruz's opinion about the orientation of any of these 6 wounds, A through F?
No, it is not.
You also said that E and F are wounds that you would group together, is that right?
Yes.
And why is that your opinion?
So they're 3 3/4 of an inch apart, which is, again, pretty similar to what A and B and C are, but they have a different orientation. When you put it on the face of the clock, they're both the same, E and F, but they're different from A, B, and C, and they're different than D.
What is their orientation?
These were at, my recollection is 5 o'clock and 11 o'clock is how they were described.
All right, and you said that D is in a different group?
Yes, so D had an orientation that was just one basically number off of A, B, and C. So it was just slightly differently oriented than A, B, and C.
I want to take you back to Exhibit 573. Sorry, tell me what you're saying. All right, we're showing you Exhibit 573 again. Now, Exhibit 573, is that the same image that appears on the left 2 of the photos that you were looking at a moment ago that is marked?
The ones that we just looked at that was a straight on of the back. This is from an angle.
All right, and let me go back and show you the last photo, the second to last photo that we looked at.
Okay.
While we're doing that, let me actually ask you, well, let me show you this exhibit first. I want to ask you a different question, and we'll come back to this. You mentioned that wounds A and B looked different than the other wounds on the back. Can you explain why those, or how those wounds had a different appearance?
Sure. So wound A, even more so than wound B, had a much larger overall size. And around the wound, so the skin around wounds A and B had additional abrasion and contusion of the surrounding skin. So in addition to the wound being larger, there was also injury to the skin around the wounds that was different than the rest of the injuries.
All right, I'm going to show you Exhibit 561. What does Exhibit 561 depict?
So this is wound A on the right side of the body. This shows the medical therapy at the top, which is the chest tube that was inserted at the hospital. And then,
just to interrupt you, the chest tube is not wound A.
Correct, that's the medical therapy. And then below that is wound A. So there's a hole in the skin, and then there's a sort of pink to red to kind of dark, maybe purplish color around the skin around that wound A, and that is the abrasion and contusion of the skin around that wound.
So is the appearance of wound A different from the appearances of wounds C through F?
Yes.
And
here's what I found.
What specifically about the appearance of wound A in this picture was different than wounds C through F?
So rather than just having a little bit of injury around the actual wound in the skin, there was this enlarged area of abrasion and contusion around the wound. So that discoloration of the skin is different than the other wounds.
All right, I want to go back and show you one more time Exhibit 573. All right, do you see wound B in this picture?
Yes.
How was the appearance of wound B different from wound C through F?
So wound B also has that injury of the skin, that's abrasion and contusion, and this time it's above the injury, so more toward the top of the picture, and it has, from here, has kind of like a pinkish to purple coloration, and the wound itself is actually at the bottom of that, and then that discoloration and injury of the skin is above.
Did you take into account the characteristics of the corn rake in this case in thinking through how to group these injuries?
Yes.
And how did you do that?
So thinking about the spacing of the tines of the corn rake being just about 3 inches, and trying to look at on the body, knowing that the body can move some or even extensively, and then looking at the features of the tines. The ends of the tines are kind of flattened, and they then sort of expand to a more rounded part of the tine. And so when I looked at the injuries and looked at Dr. Cruz's measurements, she measured all of them ultimately when she kind of reapproximated the edges of the injuries at 1/16 of an inch, which is consistent with the tines on the rake penetrating the skin, and allowed for that orientation of those tines, since they're flattened, into the body.
All right, and I want to understand what you just said. When you talk about reapproximating the edges of the injury, explain to me what that process entails.
Sure. So when a body is injured, there are invisible lines that are elastic forces in the skin that everybody has. And so when the skin is damaged, those elastic lines can pull on the wound, and they can cause them to what we call gape, or to kind of be kind of open. So if we take our hands and we remove some of that tension, we can actually make a much more accurate measurement of the wound. And so that's what Dr. Cruz did. So she reapproximated or took the edges of the wound and kind of pushed them back together to see where there was a piece of tissue that was actually lost from the puncture of that tine. And so when she did that, each of the wounds were 1/16 of an inch. That was the size of all 6 of them. Being able to push that back together, you got that approximation. So those were all the same, which made it consistent with one object also. But when you push that back together, that also allows, so you basically have this 1/16 of an inch, and then it was angled, right, or obliquely oriented like we described before. And so looking at the size and the fact that you can tell an orientation as opposed to it being just like a circle, basically, you can then look at the ends of those tines, which are flattened, and see that that flattened end of the tine is consistent with what we're seeing on the body when you reapproximate the wounds.
All right, Dr. Hammmers, I'm not a doctor, but is it your testimony that the holes in Ms. Mullis's back are not round?
When you reapproximate them, they're not round.
All right, and is the end of the corn rake round?
No, they're flattened to, I don't want to say it's rectangular, but they're flattened to that type of shape.
And does the fact that the wounds have an oblique shape, as you've described, and the corn rake has an oblique shape, does that allow you to determine, as you've described, the orientation of the wound and the orientation of the rake at the time that the rake made any of these wounds?
Yes, so because all 4 of the tines are flattened, if you have 3 wounds that have a similar orientation, and that would indicate that 3 tines are going in likely at the same time in that similar orientation.
All right, and with all of those factors in mind and those factors in your analysis that you've testified about, do you have an opinion on which, if any, of wounds A through F were caused at the same time?
So looking at just the body, from the pattern of the injuries and the individual features of each injury, it appears that wounds A, B, and C occurred at a similar time, wounds E and F at a similar time, and wound D at a somewhat different time.
And are you basing that opinion just on their orientation?
So it's the orientation and the features of the wounds.
In thinking through that, well, let me ask you this first. Do you have an opinion on the order of wounds A through F being caused?
Well, my opinion is that wounds A and B, given the features around them, is that those likely occurred in the first set of injuries and then remained in the body while other injuries occurred, given the fact that they're distorted and they have injury of the skin beyond what the other injuries have.
I want to go back to Exhibit 561 briefly. Looking at Exhibit 561 and wound A that's depicted in 561, what about this wound leads you to conclude that a tine went into wound A and remained there?
So if you take a long blunt object and it penetrates into the skin and then there's movement, it's going to cause bruising and abrasion of that surrounding skin. So if it goes straight in and straight out, we would, without any movement, we would not expect there to be this larger area of injury of the skin. So the fact that the wound is larger and has this area on the surface of the skin is very consistent with movement, and then ultimately putting that into the context of what was seen on the internal examination, that's also very supportive of that as well. So I'm talking right now about the skin itself, but my conclusions are made using the internal exam as well.
And we'll get to the internal exam in a moment, but just looking, thinking about your evaluation of wound A, how do you know, for instance, for wound A, that the features of the wound that you're describing, which you attribute to a tine being in wound A and being moved around, how do you know that those features aren't caused by a tine of the corn rake coming all the way out of wound A and then going back into wound A?
So first of all, the statistical probability of a tine coming out and going back into the same spot is very low. Second of all, I would expect that the features of the wound would not have that pattern when you reapproximate them, that it would be 1/16 of an inch, just like the rest of the injuries, that it would be more extended beyond that or more irregular. So the fact that we can reapproximate to that 1/16 of an inch is highly indicative of one penetrating injury.
And what is that issue in terms of reapproximating the size of the wound? What is your determination about the size of wound B in that respect?
Wound B also, when you approximate it, is 1/16 of an inch, just like the rest of them. So all of the wounds are consistent with the tine penetrating the body one time, and then A and B are consistent with movement of the tines while they're in the body from that one penetrating defect.
All right.
Ms. Thompson, would this be a good place for a morning break?
I think it would, Your Honor.
Okay, all right. Doctor, you may step down.
Thank you.
Let's go ahead and take 15 minutes. We'll plan on picking up at about 10 after. Court's in recess until then.
Your Honor, I'm just going to instruct the witness not to talk to anyone. I'm not going to confirm.
I won't.
Thank you. Dr. Hammmers, before we Thank you. Dr. Hammmers, before we broke, you were discussing wounds A, B, and C with us. It's your opinion that wounds A, B, and C were wounds that Ms. Mullis experienced first?
Certainly A and B, and then wound C has the similar orientation, so it makes sense from looking at those features that those may have occurred in the same process.
All right, and you've also put wounds E and F in one group and wound D in another, is that right?
Correct.
As between wounds E and F and wound D, do you have an opinion on which of those groupings were caused next?
Just from the features on the skin, I'm not able to make any determination regarding that.
Now, you described in your opinion, you described your process of reaching your opinions earlier, and I think one of the things you told us is that as a forensic pathologist, you do an external examination and you then do an internal examination. Is that right?
Yes.
Were you able to do any internal examination of Ms. Mullis's wounds here?
So I was able to review Dr. Cruz's findings and the photographs that she had taken of the internal exam, including the measurements that she had made of the wounds, some of the wounds along the wound paths, and to look at that internal process.
Did you have a narrative description from her as well about those wound paths?
Yes, so I had her autopsy report, the photos, and her notes.
Did you have testimony from Dr. Cruz as well?
Yes, I was here yesterday, and I reviewed her deposition and trial testimony.
All right, what did your, well, let me ask you this first. How many photos of the internal area of Ms. Mullis's torso did Dr. Cruz, what were taken at autopsy?
There were two photos, both were of the chest area. The skin was reflected, so the autopsy had been started, but the rib cage and the chest plate were still intact.
Was that a sufficient amount of photos, of visual evidence for you to reach your determinations in this case?
Well, just from photos alone, it would not have had her documentation in the autopsy reports with measurements that she had taken along some of the wound paths.
Did your review of the records related to the internal condition of Ms. Mullis's torso contribute to your opinions in this case?
Yes.
What did you note about the internal area of Ms. Mullis's torso?
So particularly with wounds A and B.
And let me stop you for 1 second. Let me just show you again some of the exhibits that we were looking at before. So if you could pull up, one of the demonstratives we were looking at, Your Honor, just for the record, was exhibits 573 and 574 that had some additional demonstrative markings on them. Can you show me that exhibit? I think the screen is still.
We'll see if it pops up here.
Thank you, Your Honor. Number 73 and 74. Your Honor, I think the exhibit we're going to show is a demonstrative of 572 and 574.
And the witness does have it.
All right. I'm happy to proceed. I just wasn't sure if it was showing, Your Honor. Thank you. All right. Is the court able to see the?
And I can see it.
All right. Thank you.
Yep.
I think you were explaining for us, Dr. Hammmers, what you were able to determine from your evaluation of the internal area of Ms. Mullis's torso.
Sure. So particularly with wounds A and B, the internal injuries were large in comparison to the surface of the skin, but also to the other wound paths. So Dr. Cruz captured a picture of the front of the chest plate where she had tracked the path of the injury to come out of, and it was very large, the area of muscle that was damaged. She also tracked through wound path B injuries through the right lung and measured them at 1 inch. Which is also very large in comparison to the tines on the rake, and also to the injuries on the surface of the skin.
And when you're talking about large, are you talking about the depth of the wound, or are you talking about the circumference of the
So the size of the wound. So the depth is, I'm not talking about the depth, I'm talking about the actual like diameter or size of the wound itself.
So inside Ms. Mullis's torso, were wounds A and B larger than the tine of than any of the tines of the rake?
Yes, that's correct.
Were there other wounds of the wounds between A and F that were larger than the tines of the rake?
It was really only the injuries along the pathway associated with A and B that were enlarged like that.
And what, if any, conclusions did you draw from that?
So that supported the findings on the surface of the skin indicating movement of the tine within the body. So again, if the tine had gone straight in and straight out without any movement, we would expect the size of the injuries through the body to be about the size of the tine. So having them significantly larger and extended is supportive of movement of that tine within the body. And then my conclusion of those two tines remaining in the body and moving while other injuries occurred.
So taking into account your external assessment and your internal assessment, from these assessments, were you able to determine as between E and F and as between D, which injuries Ms. Mullis experienced next?
So not just from the internal and the surface of the skin, there were also markings on the clothing and I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish your answer.
I was going to say an absence of a defect on the clothing where wound D would be. And so by putting those three things together, the external exam, the internal exam, and the clothing, I think there is some conclusions to potentially draw from the clothing analysis.
And I do want to talk to you about the clothing. You had access to information about the clothing that Ms. Mullis was wearing at the time she was brought into the hospital. Is that right?
Yes.
What information about that clothing did you have access to review?
So I had photographs of the clothing, and those photographs showed the defects in the clothes.
All right. In your process as a forensic pathologist, do you rely on clothing as part of your analysis of injuries in cases that you evaluate?
I do. So evaluation of the clothing is typically part of the external examination process. As long as the clothing comes to the autopsy, occasionally it will come later.
And how do you evaluate clothing in trying to conduct an analysis of wounds?
So what we're looking for with the clothing is, are there defects that are consistent with what we're seeing on the body, meaning in location and in size and in distribution? Are there any less defects on any of the layers of clothing than what we see on the body, or are there any more defects on any layers of the clothing that we see on the body? And then comparing the differences in the layers of clothing, which can help understand how many times each of those pieces of clothing were damaged by the object.
Setting aside layers of clothing and just talking about situations where someone only has one layer of clothes on, you mentioned that there's situations where you might see more holes in someone's shirt, for instance, than they have holes on their body. Is that right?
Occasionally, yes.
And what can be explanations for there being more holes on an item of clothing than then there are wounds in that area.
Sure. So it could be either that the clothing was damaged but the body wasn't in a certain area. In some areas that's more common. Or it could be that the clothing could have been folded, and so one penetration of that clothing actually causes a small cluster of holes together in around the same place.
And what about situations where, again, setting aside the layers question and just talking about somebody who's wearing one layer of clothing, are there situations where there are fewer holes in someone's shirt than there are wounds in that area?
It's less common, but that can happen, yes.
And what are circumstances in which that could occur?
Well, in those circumstances, it would mean that the body is injured by the object, but the object did not come completely out of the clothing. So it penetrated through the clothing one time, but then caused one or more injuries to the skin without coming completely out of the clothing.
Now, you described situations where people are wearing layers of clothing. When you have a situation where a person who's passed was wearing layers of clothing, what process do you use to evaluate the layers?
So I look at all of the layers and document what I see, because there definitely is valuable information in those. But ultimately, when I'm making my conclusions, I would say probably the most important layer is going to be the layer that's closest to the body, because you can have more discrepancies with the number of holes as you go out in the different layers, and depending on the quality of the clothing or the type of the clothing, it can be more challenging to evaluate that clothing and see defects.
Did you evaluate the clothing that was brought in with Ms. Mullis?
I looked at the photographs that were taken of the clothing.
All right, now, in this case, were there photographs that you had of Ms. Mullis's clothing at autopsy?
Yes.
And were there photos of her clothing from the hospital as well?
Yes, there were.
Did you also have photos of her clothing that were taken during a later review of her clothing?
Yes.
Was that a review that you were present for?
I was not.
Did you rely on those photos in reaching your opinions in this case?
I would say that in part I did, but I also relied on the other photos, which were consistent with, both sets of photos were consistent with each other.
I want to show the witness exhibit 890. Yes.
Hang on just a second, Jen. I think we're ready to proceed, Your Honor.
All right, may do so.
All right, do you see a photograph in front of you, Dr. Hammmers?
Yes.
What do you recognize what's depicted in photograph 890?
Yes, this is the gray t-shirt that, from my understanding, was the innermost layer of clothing that Ms. Mullis was wearing.
Is this the same gray t-shirt that you saw depicted in other photographs that you reviewed as part of your analysis here?
Yes.
And was there anything that you took into account? Let me just make a record, because the state's asked me to, that this Exhibit 890, I think the parties agree, was a photograph taken by Dr. Valentina Nye during a review of evidence in this case.
Okay.
Yeah, it's my understanding that 890 is an article of clothing that would have been on Amy Mullis's body at the time that she was killed. And that this comes from Dr. Nye's review. Is that correct?
I'll represent that to be the case.
Yeah.
Okay. Are you offering 890 at this time? Or are we just referring to it, I guess?
Let me ask the witness, Dr. Hammmers, does Exhibit 890, is Exhibit 890 a true and accurate depiction of the T-shirt that you reviewed and considered as part of reaching your opinions in this case?
Yes, it is.
I would offer Exhibit 890 into evidence then, Your Honor.
Just one more question, please.
Sure.
The photo that, or the item of clothing that is in 890 was taken by Dr. Nye, correct?
I don't know who took this photo.
And do you know when it was taken? Was it taken sometime later?
That's my understanding, but
It
I
had
don't
been
know when.
Taken later than the autopsy of Dr. Cruz, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
All right, I'm going to show the witness a different photo.
Mr. Brown, are you objecting to 890 then at this time?
With subject to those limitations, no. At this point in time, no, I'm not.
Okay. So I guess 890 is admitted with the understanding that it, well, was taken at a later time by some unidentified person or a different doctor.
All right. Dr. Hammmers, have you seen other photographs of this T-shirt where it has substantially more blood on it?
I wouldn't say substantially more blood. It just was a different color, slightly. This looks more like brown than the other photos that I saw.
All right. Does that coloring difference impact your evaluation of what's on the shirt that's depicted in Exhibit 890?
No.
All right. What, if any, conclusions did you draw from reviewing photographs of the T-shirt that Ms. Mullis was wearing in this case?
So, excuse me, the photographs of the T-shirt show defects that are consistent with wounds A, B, and C, and then wounds E and F, but there's not a defect that corresponds to wound D. Wound F has a cluster of 3 defects, kind of all combined in one area.
And what, if any, conclusions did you draw from the fact that there are fewer defects in the T-shirt in that area than the injuries, as you've just described?
So that is, to me, that is indicative of the skin being penetrated a second time and also scraped, because there's also a scrape on the skin in between these areas without the tine exiting the clothing.
For your assessment, how important was the number of holes in the T-shirt in the area of these injuries in comparison to the number of injuries in Ms. Mullis's back?
I would say that it's just as important as all of the other information that I evaluated. It helps understand, from my perspective, the movement of the rake, and it supports the tines associated with wounds A and B likely staying in the body.
I want to show you one more time the demonstrative that we've been looking at that shows the pictures of Ms. Mullis's back with the measurements that we've been looking at. I don't have a screen, so just let me know when you're seeing that, Dr. Hammmers.
I can see it.
All right. In general, all of these wounds, A through F, did you note in Dr. Cruz's autopsy report that these injuries were referred to as sharp force injuries?
I did.
Is it your opinion that these injuries are sharp force injuries? And when I say these injuries, I'm talking about the wounds A through F that we've been discussing.
In my opinion, they are not sharp force injuries.
What are they?
They are penetrating blunt force injuries.
And what is the difference between a penetrating blunt force injury and a sharp force injury?
So a sharp force injury cuts and divides the skin and typically does not leave any irregular edges on the skin like we have in these injuries. And it's made by a sharp object like a knife, a scalpel, a sharp piece of glass. Blunt injuries tear the skin. When they penetrate, they tear the skin, and they tend to cause a small amount of abrasion injury around the penetrating area, and then can cause injury, especially if there's movement, in a bigger radius or diameter around the injury. So it's a different type of wound category that we use, and it has pretty specific criteria in order to categorize them.
In a forensic pathology context, is the corn rake that you examined in this case, is that a sharp object?
It is not.
Why not?
Because the ends of the corn rake, or the different aspects of the corn rake, they're not going to cut and divide the tissue, they're going to tear the tissue. And so tearing of the tissue is a blunt injury, not a sharp injury.
Does this difference between injuries caused by a sharp force object and injuries caused by a blunt force, does that distinction matter in terms of your evaluation of this case?
I would say it doesn't change the fact that they're penetrating injuries and that this is why Ms. Mullis died, but it certainly puts the features of the injuries, both the external and internal, into a more clear context when evaluating the specifics of the pattern of injuries and the dynamics of how those injuries were sustained.
All right. If there's an exhibit in front of you, I think we can take that down. I want to talk about briefly about some other injuries on Ms. Mullis's body. You said that you considered these injuries we've been talking about that were on her back, and I want to talk about some other areas as well. Did you notice any injuries on Ms. Mullis's chest?
So she did have some injuries on her chest, yes.
And in general, what did you observe those injuries to be?
She had one defect on her right breast that was at the end of the wound path associated with wound A. And then she had bruising that was over the midline of her chest, like over her sternum, which from my review was apparent from CPR and related to that. And then she had like a small bruise that or two that were kind of on some various other areas of her torso.
Were those injuries something you determined to be blunt force injuries?
Those all fit into the category of blunt force, yes.
Does that mean those were injuries that were inflicted by another person?
No, so the one injury is from CPR, so that was inflicted essentially by trying to save Ms. Mullis's life.
Did you see any other injuries on Ms. Mullis's chest other than the injury you associated with CPR and the injury you associated with the wound path from her back that you found significant?
No.
All right. Did you look at some photographs and description from Dr. Cruz of injuries that were on Ms. Mullis's head and face?
Yes.
Was there anything that you observed on Ms. Mullis's head and face that was significant to your analysis of this case and to your opinions about the cause and manner of her death?
I would say that it was significant to my analysis of the case. In the overall context of the case, they weren't significant in the sense that they didn't cause Ms. Mullis to die, and weren't a significant factor in the reason that she died.
You were here yesterday for some testimony from Kelly Cruz about this injury on Ms. Mullis's chin that we've been discussing.
Yes.
I want to show you an exhibit that we showed to Dr. Cruz yesterday. Which is two side-by-side photos, Your Honor, of Exhibit 621 and Exhibit 570, and these have been cropped for privacy reasons. Do you have those exhibits in front of you?
Yes, I do.
Do you recognize what's depicted on Exhibit 621 and Exhibit 570?
I do.
And what is it?
These are photographs. The one on the left is a photograph that was taken at the hospital, I believe by Dr. Thompson, and the one on the right is a photograph that was taken at the time of autopsy.
How would you describe this injury? What is it?
So to me, this is like a red to purple area on the chin that ultimately, when it's photographed at the time of autopsy, has a very dark, dry coloration to it and has a somewhat translucent quality to it as well. And it is larger and more prominent at the time of autopsy than it was at the hospital.
Is that relevant to you that it looked different at autopsy than it did at the hospital earlier?
It is.
Why?
Because if you look at this just at autopsy, it appears just from the look of it and the size of it to be much more significant than it did at the hospital. It also doesn't have all of the properties of that translucent quality to it, which has a very particular kind of force that's associated with it, and can give you an indication of how that marking came to be on the body.
How did this marking come to be on Ms. Mullis's body?
So in my opinion, the qualities of this on her chin are very consistent with a pressure area where her chin was pressed up against a hard surface. And because your jaw is hard and you don't have very thick skin in this area, that compression will basically press the tissues together and cause an area that will become red to purple and will become dark and translucent over a period of time.
Is this injury something that must be caused by striking a surface?
It is not. It tends to be from pressure against a hard object.
How much pressure?
The pressure typically of a person's body. We see these markings in people who are pressed up against a hard object when they're not responsive, quite commonly.
Can you give an example of where you've seen this type of injury in other cases?
Sure. So we will see this in people who have strokes and can't move and are in one position without being able to move, and also commonly in people who experience drug overdoses, particularly with opiates. They'll become unconscious, and if they're pressed up against a hard surface, they'll develop pressure marks like this.
How long would someone's body need to be pressed up against a hard surface to experience this kind of injury?
It doesn't actually take a very long time. It could be a matter of just a couple of minutes in order to cause that. It really depends on how hard the surface is, how firmly the skin is pressed up against it, and then how thick the tissue is between either like the underlying surfaces that are either bone or soft tissue.
Is this injury that's depicted in Exhibit 621 and Exhibit 570 the result of somebody striking Ms. Mullis in the face?
So there are no features of that I would expect if somebody struck her in the face. We would expect her to have swelling, more extensive bruising. I don't see any of that and didn't see any documentation of that in the records.
Well, let me ask you this. Did you hear some testimony from Dr. Cruz yesterday about Ms. Mullis's ear having some bruising on it?
Yes.
Did you see that bruising in the materials you observed?
I did.
Can you determine what might have caused that bruising?
Yes.
what?
So she has multiple earrings that are in the area of that bruising and are very consistent. They're small bruises that are right in the area of those earrings. So either from, some hard like pressure against that area or the EMT who testified talked about log rolling Miss Mullis to get her on the sheet to put her in the ambulance. So certainly that process could do that with just pressure of the ear against the ground.
Did you see any, well, let me ask you this. Dr. Cruz testified yesterday about a cut on Miss Mullis's lip. Did you see that cut when you were conducting your review of this case?
I did. I believe that she documented it and testified that it was an abrasion.
And thanks for clarifying that. I'm marking on her mouth.
Sure, yes.
And could you determine what the cause of that abrasion was?
No, there's nothing specific about that indicates like what caused it. It was small and somewhat dry to even a little bit like reddish brown on her upper lip.
Did you, in any of the materials that you reviewed, observe any swelling on Miss Mullis's face?
Her eye looked like it was kind of swollen or a little bit larger than the other side. So the left was a little larger than the right side, but there was no change in color to it under the surface of the skin.
Was that swelling an indication of blunt force trauma?
It was not. It was actually the result of the medical interventions that she underwent.
And how's that?
So she experienced something called subcutaneous emphysema. That's basically where through the process of CPR, whether it's through trying to get air into a person's body through a King tube or an endotracheal tube, or because she had injuries that involved her chest wall, air will get under the surface of the skin and travel through the fatty tissues, and it will cause basically the air to get trapped in there, and areas of the body will become they can look almost swollen. And so she had that on her left eye, and it was also documented that it was traveling down her chest all the way down to the area of like her hips.
I want to now show you an exhibit that is exhibits 566 and 634 combined, and there has been, just for the record, some slight cropping of one of these photographs just for privacy reasons.
I can see it.
Can you see those exhibits?
Yes.
What is depicted in exhibit 566 and 634 in front of you?
So this is an area of the left knee. In the right-hand picture, you can see a yellow object beneath that discoloration. That's medical intervention, as well as a small piece of tubing. That's also part of the medical intervention. Just at like the lower part of the knee, there's an area of a reddish purple contusion or bruising to the skin with some overlying scrapes or abrasions to the skin involving the knee.
Were any of the bruising that you observed or saw described in materials that you reviewed signs of a struggle with a person?
Nothing specific about these indicate that they're from a struggle, and also like the location and the features of them, they're not even highly likely to be from a struggle. They could be from a vast number of happenings.
I'm going to show the witness now an exhibit that is just exhibits 513 and 517 next to one another. Do you have those photos in front of you?
Yes, I do.
What's depicted in exhibits 513 and 517?
So these are the back surfaces of Miss Mullis's hands. The right hand is on the bottom and the left hand is on the top, and these were taken at the time of autopsy.
Are there any injuries to Miss Mullis's hands that you can see in this picture?
There are.
And can you draw any conclusions from the injuries that you see on her hands?
I can say that they're abrasions and contusions, that they're small, and they're over, most of them are over somewhat prominent surfaces of her hands, meaning some of the like knuckle areas, and they are nondescript, so they don't let you know specifically what they're caused from.
Are these injuries signs of Ms. Mullis having struggled with another person?
The number, the distribution, the pattern of them are not indicative of that. They're not even highly suggestive of that. They are, again, sort of too general to draw any specific conclusion from.
I'm going to just show the witness what we've marked as Exhibit 275. I'm going to just show the witness what's been marked as Exhibit 275. Do you recognize what Exhibit 275, or do you know what Exhibit 275 is?
I do.
Are the injuries that you see on Ms. Mullis's hands consistent with someone whose hands could fit into Exhibit 275, putting their hand inside of it to wash the inside of it or to touch the inside of it in some way?
I'm going to object to speculation.
Sustained.
Have you ever seen Exhibit 275 before?
I don't know if I saw that exact one, but I have seen similar objects like that before.
Where have you seen similar objects to Exhibit 275?
When I visited the farm, I saw that those were covering like lights and being used as like a protector for light bulbs.
Are the injuries that you observed on Ms. Mullis's hands consistent with her knuckles or the outside of her hands being abraded on a rough surface?
Yes.
All right. In general, well, have you described all of the external injuries on Ms. Mullis's body, not just on her back, but on other areas of her body that you took into account in evaluating in reaching your opinions in this case?
There's a couple of more like bruises that were on her legs that were documented in different places, but again, they were small, nondescript, and there was nothing about the location, pattern, or features of any individual wound together or alone that indicated any specific event or type of trauma that would have caused them.
Have you had cases as a forensic pathologist where the overall number of blunt force trauma injuries on someone's body was an indicator to you of the cause and manner of their death?
Yes, I have.
And is this such a case?
This is not.
Why not?
Looking at the blunt injuries in total, putting them into the context of the penetrating injuries, and then putting them into the context of what we know about how Ms. Mullis was found, how she was transported to the hospital, and how she was treated at the hospital, and what she was doing prior to her being found unresponsive. The blunt injuries, again, alone and combined, really don't have, in my opinion, any significance to why she died.
Are there explanations in the process you just described, from your understanding, the things she was doing that day, the way that she was brought to the hospital, the medical intervention that would explain the markings on her body, accepting the wounds A through F that we've been discussing?
Yes, and I would add in addition, like the way that she was reported to have been found, in addition to those things.
And how would the way that she was reported to have been found, how would that impact that analysis as well?
So she was reported that her arms were under her and her face was on the ground, and so, or at least face down. So, you know, that would help explain the jaw, the marking on her jaw, being pressed against a hard surface of the barn, and potentially explain some of the injuries on her hands from her either moving around on the ground or collapsing.
Would her being carried to a vehicle to be brought to the hospital explain some of her bruising?
It's certain.
I'm going to object as speculation as well.
Sustained.
You've told us that you reviewed records in this case, and you've explained to us your opinion and analysis about the injuries on Ms. Mullis's back, the wounds A through F that we've been discussing. Taking into account everything that you reviewed in this case, Dr. Hammmers, do you have an opinion on the cause of Ms. Mullis's death?
I do.
What's your opinion?
So my opinion is that Ms. Mullis died as a result of her left-sided pneumothorax from the penetrating injuries of her torso.
And can you explain how a pneumothorax would have caused her penetrating injuries and caused her death?
So the penetrating injuries caused her pneumothorax. And so what happens is if you have an injury that penetrates into your chest cavity, and especially if it's small, air can go into the chest cavity around the lung and put pressure on the lung, and it can't escape. So each time you breathe, air moves into that space, but it gets trapped and can't come back out. If the defect or injury is large, air is going to be able to go in and out of that injury or set of injuries. So to develop a pneumothorax, you need the air to be able to move in and become trapped, which is what was identified at the hospital, shown in the x-ray, and also documented on the right side that there was not a significant pneumothorax, if any. And so it was very clear on the x-rays that she had a pneumothorax, and that would have been caused by the two penetrating defects from wounds E and F that Dr. Cruz documented in her autopsy report.
Did Ms. Mullis have a pneumothorax on her right side?
So she did not. So when the chest tube was inserted at the hospital, they documented that there was a small amount of blood and a small amount of air. That together with the size of the injuries that she had on her chest wall, particularly the one that I described on the front of her chest, between her muscles of her ribs, and then the larger size of that injuries A and B, the size of those injuries would allow air to move in and out of the lung and not become trapped, and that placement of the chest tube supports that fact that air was not becoming entrapped around the right lung. The other things that supports that is that the right lung was pretty well aerated or filled with air, which is not what happens when you get a pneumothorax. It presses on the lung and collapses it, like what happened on the left-hand side, and then it will also press all of your structures in the midline of your body toward the opposite side, which is what they saw very clearly on the x-ray at the hospital.
Can someone with a collapsed lung yell or scream?
They may be able to try, but it's going to be challenging for them to get any amount of air to push out of their lungs that can move across their vocal cords to give them a voice, basically, because that's what we're relying on when we talk, is the air movement out of our body across our vocal cords to be able to make our vocalizations.
Were you here for Dr. Cruz's testimony yesterday about her opinion that Ms. Mullis, with her injuries, would have been alive for a few minutes potentially?
Yes.
Do you agree with that assessment?
I do agree with that, yes.
After Ms. Mullis experienced the injuries that are reflected in wounds A through F, would she have been able to get up and walk around?
Yes, she would have been. So her becoming unconscious and then ultimately dying would have been a process. So when you get a pneumothorax, you don't get it all at one time. It builds up each time that you breathe. So each time you breathe, you would get more and more air into your lungs, but during that time period, you would still be conscious and be able to have willful activity.
Were you here for Dr. Cruz's testimony yesterday about the mechanism of Ms. Mullis's death?
Yes.
And do you agree with her testimony?
I do not.
And what do you disagree with?
So Miss Mullis, her mechanism of death, which is the physiologic process that happens to you when you're dying, her cause of death was basically respiratory depression occurring because of the pneumothorax. That was the primary mechanism that was happening in her body. So she was having decreased oxygen available to get into her body because of the that happened because of a respiratory depression from the pneumothorax. So she wasn't dying because of anything on the right side, which Dr. Cruz did say that she may have been able to live with medical treatment on the right side, and it really was the left side.
Does Dr. Cruz's autopsy report reflect the correct mechanism of Ms. Mullis's death?
Well, I don't believe that Dr. Cruz listed a mechanism of death in the autopsy report.
Is it a generally accepted practice in forensic pathology for the autopsy report not to reflect that?
Typically, the autopsy report does not reflect that, neither does the death certificate. That usually is something that is either answered in a conversation about what happened, or if I would go and, let's say, testify, I often am asked about the mechanism.
Did you review Dr. Cruz's trial testimony from Mr. Mullis's trial in 2019?
Yes.
Did Dr. Cruz identify the correct mechanism of death in that testimony?
She did not.
You described earlier in your testimony that you use the scientific method as part of in order to evaluate the manner of someone's death. Is that right?
So determining the manner of death and the cause of death is part of that process, yes.
All right, and did you apply the scientific method in your evaluation of Ms. Mullis's, the cause and manner of Ms. Mullis's death?
I did.
Did you test some hypotheses as part of your use of the scientific method about how to evaluate how Ms. Mullis would have received the injuries, the wounds A through F that we've been talking about in her back?
I did.
What hypotheses did you test to evaluate how Ms. Mullis received those injuries?
So when we have a penetrating injury can basically fit any category of manner of death outside of a natural death. So it could be an accident, a suicide, a homicide, or an undetermined death. So starting with all four of those is where when you have an injury is kind of the hypothesis that you're testing. And the manner of death primarily comes from the investigative information. So the autopsy alone typically does not answer the manner of death. So you can get information about the manner of death from the autopsy, but really the manner is putting the investigative information, all of the records that you have, and any kind of additional information that you have into the context of those injuries to then determine the manner of death. So the manner of death typically is not often unique or completely known just from the autopsy.
And in Ms. Mullis's case, could the manner of her death be determined just from the information that was learned at autopsy?
In my opinion, no. Dr. Cruz testified that she was aware that it was a corn rake and aware that the corn rake had been found at least partially in Miss Mullis's body, and she had the autopsy findings. She didn't have the medical records, she didn't have the EMS information, she didn't have her toxicology back, and from her testimony, it sounds like she made that determination without the other information.
In your experience as a professor of pathology and a person who's been responsible for training other pathologists, is that the kind of mistake that inexperienced pathologists sometimes make?
It can be. I mean, we all learn throughout our career, and we're trained, but that's not where your learning stops. So we continue to learn, to understand, to grow, and we, may look back on the cases that we've done or the decisions that we've made and view them differently in light of new experiences and new training that we may undergo or more cases that we've seen.
So in evaluating the manner of Ms. Mullis's death, I think it's your testimony that this is not a natural death. So in considering those other 4 options, did you test the hypothesis that Ms. Mullis experienced these wounds in her back by someone swinging the corn rake into her back?
I did.
And how did you test that hypothesis?
So I tested by observing of the corn, understanding the size of the corn rake, the facing times, the distribution, or looking at photos, going and see to try to understand if somebody could swing, and also looking to see what was around that area, and then putting that into what's kind of known in my training and education, what's in the literature of other types of injuries that may occur from similar objects, and then in the information that we had, both from what Ms. Mullis's husband and son reported to what was observed through the treatment and from Dr. Cruz.
What was your conclusion about whether or not that hypothesis was possible, that she received these injuries by somebody swinging this corn rake into her back?
So my conclusion was that that was not consistent with what was on her body, both in the directions that the pathways traveled in her body and the difference in the pathways in her body and in the context of the spacing at the shed itself.
I want to show you a demonstrative exhibit. And just one moment, Your Honor. Let me explain to the state what we're going to show.
I think we're going to have some more things, more issues. I know it's afternoon, so.
Sure. If this is a good time to take our lunch break so that you have some time to visit, let's do that. We'll plan on trying to pick back up about 1:15. Court is in recess until then. Doctor, you can step down. Thank you.
Much deeper than
Okay, we'll go back on the record. Doctor, I would just remind you that you remain under oath. Ms. Thompson, are you ready to pick back up with your direct?
I am, thank you, Your Honor. And I think there was the parties had conferred about a demonstrative exhibit right before the break, and I think we've resolved that issue.
Wonderful, thank you.
All right. Dr. Hammmers, before we broke for lunch, you were starting to talk about some of the hypotheses that you tested in this case. Before we get to that, I want to go back to one thing that we discussed earlier in your testimony, which is the groupings of the wounds on Ms. Mullis's back, wounds A through F that we were discussing earlier. And I'm going to show you an exhibit that we looked at earlier, which shows the wounds and the measurements. Do you have that exhibit in front of you?
Not quite yet.
Okay, thank you. It's
Okay. This one?
it's the one with the measurements on it.
Oh, never mind. Okay.
What's that?
I got you.
Do you have the photo in front of you?
I do
Dr.
now.
Hammmers? Now, in your review of Dr. Cruz's materials from the autopsy, did she document the trajectory that these wounds took within Ms. Mullis's body?
She did.
And going through the wounds from A to F, can you tell us what those trajectories were?
Sure. So wound A was from the back of the body toward the front, from the right of the body to the left, and slightly downward.
What about wound B?
B was the same, right to left, forward and slightly downward.
What about C?
It was also the same, front to back, right to left and slightly downward.
And D?
And that was the same, front to back, or back to front, sorry, back to front, right to left and slightly downward.
What about E?
E was back to front, right to left, and sharply upward.
And what about F?
Back to front, right to left, and sharply upward.
Were you able to determine from Dr. Cruz's documentation the specific path that any of these wounds took through Ms. Mullis's chest?
So she did document like rib spaces that they went through, and the injuries with A and B, she documented specifically the organs that they struck.
Does documentation of the rib spaces help you determine with some specificity the path that certain wounds took through her chest?
Yes, it gives you either an ending point or a point along the way that you can tell if it's going slightly downward, upward, or sharply upward or downward.
Is there something with people's rib cages called an intercostal space?
Yes.
Can you explain what that is?
Yes, so you have 12 ribs, and in between your ribs, that's called the intercostal space. And so you have your first rib, and then your second rib, and your first intercostal space is between the first and second rib, and so on as you go down the rib cage.
And every person has 12 ribs?
Yes, in general, yes.
So for everyone, though, the numbering of those intercostal spaces is the same?
Correct, it's the same. It's always the space below it is the number of the rib above it.
And so for which of these wounds were you able to determine, because of the other things in Ms. Mullis's body that they passed through, what their more precise path was?
So A and B went through rib spaces, and E and F went through rib spaces. C and D only went into the soft tissue and muscle of the back.
I'm going to show you another demonstrative, which we conferred with the state about before the break. This is purely a demonstrative exhibit, Your Honor. It's not being offered into evidence. We've referred to it as demonstrative A. Do you see the demonstrative in front of you?
I do.
Would using demonstrative A assist you in describing your testimony, Dr. Hammmers?
Yes.
What is depicted in demonstrative A?
So demonstrative A has the wounds A through F. It is a look at from the side of the body. So looking basically like from the right to the left side. So it's two-dimensional, but it has all the wounds A through F. It has their relative location on the body, and then the direction with an arrow that the pathway travels based off of the locations that Dr. Cruz had documented in her autopsy report.
And does figure A depict the trajectories and the relative depths of wounds A through F based on your understanding of Dr. Cruz's documentation?
Yes, it does.
Did any of the information that's depicted in the demonstrative in front of you, the trajectories, the relative depths, the directions of the wounds, did that assist you in your understanding of which wounds you consider to be grouped together in some way?
I would say yes.
And how?
So it allowed me to understand that A through D had a similar, essentially a similar pathway in the body, and that E and F had a very different and distinct pathway in the body. It also explained and confirmed my suspicion about wounds A and B being caused from the tines staying in the body and being much deeper than wound C, and also confirmed that wound D, where it did not come out of the clothing, it also only went into the body a very shallow depth.
Now, from what you told us before the break, it's your opinion that Ms. Mullis experienced wound D at a different time from A, B, and C. Is that right?
Well, different from, I guess, the grouping of A, B, and C, but what I've testified to is that from my review, A and B did not leave the body, so then C would have been at a different time than D, essentially.
And is your understanding of the trajectories of these wounds, is that inconsistent with your understanding of, is anything about the trajectories of these wounds inconsistent with your opinions about when and in what order Ms. Mullis experienced these wounds?
No.
All right. In thinking about the trajectories of these wounds, what were the trajectories of wounds A through F relative to Ms. Mullis's body?
What do you mean by that?
Well, if we think of and I understand that we're not talking in terms of the actual position that Ms. Mullis's body was in when she experienced these injuries, whether she's laying down or standing up. I'm not asking you about that, but treating her body as a vertical object, where were the wounds relative in terms of the trajectory? What was the trajectory relative to her body?
I'm still not 100% sure that I understand what you mean. Or, I don't know, are you asking about the anatomic position and how we measure them, or are you asking about something else?
I appreciate that question. If we treat the axis of the body as a vertical axis, how would you describe the trajectory of these wounds relative to that axis?
Oh, I think I understand now. Okay, so they're all going from the back of the body toward the front. They are all going from the right side of the body toward the left, and then A through D are going slightly downward, and E and F are so toward her feet, essentially, but only very slightly, and then E and F are going up toward her head.
And those wounds A to C, when you say they're going slightly downward, are those near horizontal?
Very close to horizontal, yes.
Okay. Before we broke, I think we were starting to talk about your hypotheses in this case, and I think the hypothesis that you were discussing before we broke was the hypothesis that someone swung this corn rake into Ms. Mullis's back. And I apologize because I don't remember. Did you tell us what your conclusion was about this hypothesis?
I honestly don't remember.
Well, what was your hypothesis? What was your hypothesis, or what was your conclusion about the hypothesis that Ms. Mullis experienced these wounds in her back from someone swinging the corn rake into her back?
So my conclusion is that the pathway is not consistent with the features of the corn rake and the space within the shed to be able to cause this set of injuries in these pathways.
So leaving the position of the shed out of your analysis for a minute, were you able to determine, without knowing anything about the shed on the Mullis farm, whether this hypothesis was true or not?
The swinging
Yes.
hypothesis? Well, with swinging, that can't describe, if you sort of have swinging in any sort of way, shape, or form, it can't describe the entire set of injuries that have occurred.
Why not?
Because There's 4 tines to the rake, there's 6 injuries plus the scrape to her back, and they are in different directions.
Is it possible or were you able to disprove the hypothesis that someone caused these injuries in Ms. Mullis's back by someone swinging the rake into her back more than once?
I was.
And what's your determination about that hypothesis?
That is not true because the clothing does not support that.
How does the clothing not support that?
So the outer coat of the clothing has even fewer holes than what we saw on the inner clothing, indicating that at least some of the tines of the rake did not exit the clothing in total at all.
Now, is it your testimony that the physical characteristics of the shed on the Mullis property contributed to your determination that someone could not have swung this rake into Ms. Mullis's back to cause these injuries?
Yes, that's part of it.
And you said that you visited the shed on the property, is that right?
I did.
What was it about the shed on the property that contributed to your opinions that this is not possible?
So the openings in the shed are very narrow and leave little room to either side in order to swing a rake. And that would mean swinging from overhead would be necessary, and that does not add up with the direction of the wounds and the number of the wounds.
I'm going to show you an exhibit that's been marked. I'm going to show you an exhibit that's been marked as 731. Do you recognize what is depicted in Exhibit 731?
Yes.
What is it?
This is one of the walkways in the shed.
Does Exhibit 731 truly and accurately depict the interior of the Mullis shed at the time that you visited it?
To the best of my recollection, yes, it does.
All right, we'll seek to admit Exhibit 731, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No objection.
731 is admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. Do you have any understanding of where in this shed Ms. Mullis might have? Let me ask you a better question. What the hypotheses that you were considering about Ms. Mullis having someone swing the rake into her back in this shed? What areas of the shed did you consider in that hypothesis?
So basically the only open areas of the shed where you could walk, which were all very narrow within the shed. And then there was an area in the shed where it was reported that she was going to get a carrier. And that was in an area in one of those narrow walkways.
From your review of photographs and descriptions of this shed and from your own visit to the shed, did you determine any area inside of the shed that would allow for the hypothesis that someone swung a corn rake into Ms. Mullis's back in that area of the shed?
I did not.
Did you test a hypothesis that Ms. Mullis received wounds A through F from someone pushing the corn rake into her back?
I did consider that, yes.
And what was your conclusion about that hypothesis?
So my conclusion was, from my experience and training, I've not seen any kind of injuries like that with having multiple tines of any type of object able to push into somebody, and comparing that to other cases that I have which have not been from a corn rake but from different weapons, that not being ever reported to me, ever seen by me, or anything that I've witnessed any of my colleagues having, where someone has been able to push an object like that through somebody's clothes and into their body one time, let alone multiple times.
Did you test a hypothesis that Ms. Mullis received these injuries by falling onto this corn rake one or more times?
Yes.
And what did you determine about that hypothesis?
So from considering that hypothesis, based off of all of the information that I reviewed, that was the most likely and reasonable hypothesis, given the location, the distribution of the injuries, the features of the injuries, the features of the corn rake, and my experience in training.
We agree that if Ms. Mullis experienced these injuries by falling, she had to have fallen on this corn rake more than once. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Why does the hypothesis that she fell on this corn rake fit with the evidence as you understand it?
So the fact that it appears that she received wounds A, B, and C clustered together, and that wound D is in a similar area to C but is much more shallow, and there's movement of wounds A and B, and all of those injuries are in a similar distribution. I would expect that there could be more shallow injuries from her falling, even potentially from different heights or different distances above the ground. And then the change in that orientation with wounds, tines A and B staying inside those wounds, and then her sustaining the other two injuries. So to me, when I look at all the features of the wounds consistent with coming from the same object, and then the similarities in their orientation, that to me is the most likely and reasonable scenario for how those injuries occurred. And it fits with the differences of the features that I saw inside and outside of the body with wounds A and B.
Did you get any information from Ms. Mullis's medical history about prescription medications that she was taking around the time of her death?
Yes.
From the medical records, what were you able to determine about that?
So she had 5 medications that were listed as her current medications. 3 of them were medications that can sort of have a similar effect on the body, and in my training and experience were the more significant of the 3 medications that she was on that were listed in her medical record. 2 of them appeared to be medication she was on typically, and then 1 of them was a medication she was given post-operatively after her procedure.
And what would have been the consequences of those medications?
So those medications all can have similar effects of dizziness, somnolence, meaning sleepiness, and kind of like, those are like the 2 main, dizziness and tiredness.
Did the toxicology report that accompanied the autopsy in this case reveal those medications?
Can you ask me that again? I'm sorry.
Sure. Did the toxicology report that was conducted as part of Dr. Cruz's autopsy in this case, did it reveal those medications?
It did not.
And is there a reason why?
So the toxicology panel that was tested for does not include those medications in what is tested for. So you have to have a panel of medications that you're testing for, and you're only going to potentially get positive results from the medications that are being looked for.
What is the generally accepted practice in the field of forensic pathology with respect to autopsies for seeking more than a basic toxicology panel in a case?
So the recommendation from the National Association of Medical Examiners is that you know the medication somebody is potentially taking, weigh them in your evaluation, and order testing that is appropriate for the information that you have.
And in this situation, given the information that was available with respect to the autopsy, was this a situation that where a generally accepted practice would be to seek more than a basic panel for the toxicology testing?
So in my training and experience, yes, this panel is, in my experience, and using this same lab, so I'm familiar with the panel, is a limited panel and misses medications that a very high number of the population actually take routinely. So it's really looking for substances of abuse or medications that are commonly abused.
You talked earlier before the break and in your testimony just now about seeking contextual information as part of your determinations, seeking information about medical history and the area where someone's injuries might have occurred, and looking at investigative records. Is there any concern for you as a forensic pathologist that contextual information could bias you in some way to information that you're seeing at autopsy?
I would say no. Our job and the recommendation of all of our national organizations is that the job of the forensic pathologist is to be trained and have experience to weigh all of those items and balance out what is in them with what we have at autopsy, and to ultimately make a decision about cause and manner of death. So that's the whole reason that we're trained, is to gather that information, assess it, and form opinions.
Do you need that contextual information in certain cases to reach your determinations?
I would say that we need it in the vast majority of cases, but certainly cases that are more complicated, but we never know sort of how a case is going to turn out and the complexities that will come with it. So best practices are to have the information that's available through the steps that we described, if it's available and accessible.
Did you reach an opinion in this case, Dr. Hammmers, about how you would classify the manner of Ms. Mullis's death?
I did.
And what is your conclusion after consideration of all of the background evidence and the evaluation of the hypotheses that you considered in this case?
My opinion is that the manner of death is best classified as an accident.
Why is that?
All of the information that I had available to me to review, it fits with the injuries that were seen. It makes logical sense. There was, witness statements, there was medical information that all came together to add up to what was seen on the body. So there wasn't anything about the injuries and how Ms. Mullis was described as being found, or the implement that was found in her, the way it was reported, the way her body was reported, that made this inconsistent with anything but an accident. I'm sorry, consistent with anything but an accident. I apologize.
For a forensic pathologist to determine that the manner of death in a case is a homicide, what is the generally accepted practice in forensic pathology about the level of proof that a forensic pathologist needs to have to make that determination?
So typically we use to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, but another way to say that would be that it's far more likely than not. So it's not just 51% that this is a homicide. It's that all of the information that you have far outweighs this being a homicide than anything else.
Is your determination that that the manner of Ms. Mullis's death was an accident, is that dependent on an understanding that her death must have occurred in the shed?
I would say no. It's not dependent on that, although I haven't seen any information that indicates that that this occurred at any other location.
Is there a process as a medical examiner for a medical examiner to reconsider the official cause of death that they identified in a death certificate or in other documentation about a case?
Yes.
What is that process?
So it's, there's no sort of formal name for it, but basically any case that you have, someone can always come and ask you to reconsider it. The death certificate is always subject to being able to be changed with new information that changes your cause or manner of death. And so anytime somebody poses new information, you can take that information, review the case in light of that new information, and then decide if you will or will not change the death certificate.
Are there any situations in your career where someone has come to you with new information about a case where you've made an official determination about cause or manner of death?
Yes, there have been.
And under generally accepted practices in forensic pathology, what is the response of a forensic, what should the response of a forensic pathologist be in that situation?
Well, in every case that I've had or other people have had where I've worked, the information that comes is taken seriously. It's reviewed. Typically, it's reviewed with someone who is a superior to you. So I would review it, then I would sit down with my boss and discuss it, and we would come to an understanding of, you know, what that material, how that material that was new weighed into what we already had, and if that changed the ultimate opinions or not.
Are you familiar with a concept called implicit bias?
Yes.
What is that?
I'm going to object. It's outside the scope of this witness's knowledge.
I agree. Sustained.
Do you understand, are you familiar with a field of science called biomechanical engineering?
Yes.
In general terms, what's your understanding of what
Again, I'm going to object. Same objection.
Did you want to respond?
I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt the court. This is in Dr. Hammmers' report that she considered this field and that she consulted with an expert in this field in reaching her opinions. I don't intend to go into the details of this field. That's not my purpose, but just to, that's the purpose for these questions, Your Honor.
I believe they have a biomechanical expert that is the next witness. I don't know why we have to rehash this. It's outside our scope.
Very, very, let's keep it very, very limited.
Understood, Your Honor.
Very limited. And again, I'll read the report. Obvious, you know, this isn't a jury trial. Let's try to move this along, please, Ms. Thompson.
Understood,
Okay.
Your Honor. Let me ask you this question, Dr. Hammmers. Do forensic scientists consult in some cases with biomechanical experts in reaching their opinions?
Yes.
Is that a generally accepted practice in your field?
Yes, it is.
Did you consult with a biomechanical expert in considering your opinions in this case?
I certainly read their report, but I had my own opinions separate from what the biomechanical expert had to say. It happened that their opinion supported what I already believed to be the case, which was this was an accident, but my opinions and my conclusions were made outside of that.
The opinions that you've offered in your testimony here today, are any of those opinions based on new developments in the field of forensic pathology since 2019?
No.
Are these opinions that you could have offered in 2019?
Yes.
Just one moment, Your Honor. Is the report that you referenced reading in the field of biomechanical engineering, in this case, a report from someone named Dr. Susan Boley?
Yes.
And did you consider the information in Dr. Boley's opinion, the report that you read in reaching your opinions in this case?
I did consider it, yes.
Your Honor, on that basis, we are seeking to admit Dr. Boley's report in this case, and I think that we could take up the issue of its admissibility at another time, but we are, at this point, making a proffer that we'd seek to admit it based on this testimony.
And for the reasons we've already stated early on in testimony earlier this morning, we have the same objection to that based upon the same cases that I cited.
Okay, sure. And we'll save that argument for another time so we can keep moving forward.
I have no other questions at this time, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Dr. Hammmers, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. You agree the wounds that caused Amy Mullis's death, as they've been described by Kelly Cruz, you agree with that, correct?
That the set of puncture wounds caused her death?
Right.
Yes, that's
Right.
correct.
And there were other injuries to her body that were observed at autopsy, these blunt force injuries that you've described?
Yes, there were blunt force injuries, correct.
So you agree with Cruz on what she calls them sharp force injuries, you call them something else, but it's the stab wounds that caused her death, correct?
I wouldn't call them stab wounds, but the penetrating wounds, yes.
So penetrating wounds, as observed at autopsy, you agree with Dr. Cruz that those caused Amy Mullis's death, correct?
They caused her death, correct.
Right. And the number of injuries Kelly Cruz counted correctly, would that be true?
A through F, yes.
Okay. And you agree that A through F were the injuries that were observed at autopsy?
Correct.
You don't have any contrary information or anything that you observed from the autopsy of Kelly Cruz that would contradict that, correct?
In regard to the number of injuries, if we're just talking to the ones on her back, yes, I agree
Correct.
with that.
That's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
You agree with Cruz on the orientation of the injuries on the back, correct?
Yes.
You don't have any dispute with the measurements that she made with regard to the distance between the injuries, correct?
Correct. I'm not disagreeing with her measurements.
Or the depth of the injuries?
I'm not disagreeing with her depth measurements.
4 of the injuries, A through D, were downward, and the other 2, E and F, were upward?
Correct.
Okay. And I think I asked you this already about all the blunt force injuries. You agree those were all documented correctly. Is that right?
As far as, I would say, the location and the general description,
And the photographs that you were able to observe.
yes.
I think the only thing you really, maybe were critical of Dr. Cruz on was that she should have taken more photos of the internal injuries. Is that true?
I mean, if we're just talking about the autopsy process, I would say, yes, she could have taken more internal photographs.
So what it really boils down to is your disagreement with Dr. Cruz is that she ruled this a homicide and you would have ruled it an accident, right? Is that what this really comes down to?
I mean, I would say that's the final statement, but I think there's other things in between that I don't agree with the way that she's described them or testified to them.
You may have done the autopsy differently, correct? You may have done different things if you would have done the autopsy to Amy Mullis.
True, maybe.
And that differs from pathologist to pathologist, isn't that true?
I mean, yes, there's going to be some variation.
Right. I mean, the core of what you do is basically the same, but there may be some variations there, correct?
True.
All right. Now, I know that you discussed these hypotheses here, but swinging the rake could cause the injuries that we see on her back, correct?
I don't know that they could, actually.
Not at all? Can completely exclude it?
I believe that I testified that I did exclude that as a possibility.
Okay. You could push the rake into Amy Mullis's back, correct?
I believe I disagreed with that as well.
Okay. So an attacker, let's assume there's an attacker, okay, that's not an accident. They could take the rake and use it as a weapon and push it into Amy Mullis's back, right? They could do that.
I believe I just testified just a little while ago that I've never seen that, I've never read that, and I've never read any report of somebody pushing a corn rake into somebody's back.
I'm not sure there is another murder with a corn rake out there. Would you agree?
Your objection is?
I apologize, I'm not trying to get animated, Your Honor, but that really assumes, obviously, the exact issue that we're here to talk about, whether there's another murder with a corn rake. Because the issue here is whether this was a murder, Your Honor, that's why we're here.
Okay, well. Kelly, can you read me the question again?
I'm not sure that there is another murder with a corn rake out there. Would you agree?
Mr. Brown, I guess, maybe can you just ask a new question?
So I will. So I think we both can agree that the death by corn rake is something unique. Would that be true?
I would say it's unique in the specific implement, but there certainly have been cases of people dying with other farming type of implements that are in the category of a rake.
Or other instruments that are sharp enough to penetrate the body, correct?
Yes.
You see that all the time.
I wouldn't say all the time, but we see it
But like a knife wound.
enough.
Right? Like
Right,
some-
but this is very different than a knife
I
wound.
understand, but it's something that penetrates the body that causes death. You have seen that before.
Yes,
Okay.
correct.
We can both agree that the corn rake, specifically as an implement to do that, is unique. True?
Yes, that's true.
There are 6 injuries to the back of Amy Mullis that are penetrating injuries, correct?
Yes,
4 times on the corn rake.
yes,
That means it penetrated her body more than 1 time, correct?
yes.
All right. There has been a suggestion by Dr. Cruz that it was 2, very likely 3 times, and I assume you would agree with that.
The only thing that I would say is I think there had to be more than one episode of her being penetrated, but that doesn't imply that it was like that there was no contact with the body or no times in the body when those additional penetrations occurred.
All right. So there's 4 times on the corn rake, correct?
Yes,
We have 4 wounds that are in the same orientation in that you're nodding, so you agree with me, correct?
No.
No?
they're in the same direction, but they do
Okay.
not have the same orientation on the surface of the
Okay,
skin.
my apologies. But they're in the same direction, correct? And there are 4 of those, A, B, C, and D?
The path through the body is the same, yes,
Okay.
or similar.
And then there are 2 others that you have identified that would have happened at a different time, correct?
I don't know that I would say a different time, but
How would you say it? How did you say it?
they're traveling in a different direction, so they likely happened together, but I wouldn't specify the time.
So you've classified this as an accident in your opinion, correct?
Yes,
So that means that the corn rake would have to be in a position where Amy Mullis could fall on it, correct?
correct.
So it would have to be laying presumably on the ground, right?
I don't know that I would draw that conclusion because I'm not a biomechanical engineer, so I can't speak to the exact forces, but she would have to have enough acceleration of her body to generate enough force for that to pierce her clothing and her body.
Putting the rake on the ground, that would probably be the place furthest away from her where enough force could be generated to cause the injuries that you see, correct?
So again, I think it's very plausible that the rake could be on the ground, but I can't speak to the specific forces that it would take because I haven't done those calculations and don't have that expertise.
She would have to lose consciousness or strength, right, in order to fall. Would that be right?
She would have to do what?
She'd have to like pass out,
In order to fall?
correct?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound like alarmed, I'm sorry. No, I mean, you can trip and fall, you could step on equipment and fall. Like, I don't think that consciousness is inferred from her falling.
But it would have to be with enough force that the tines of the rake could penetrate her body, correct?
Correct.
And that this happened multiple times, correct?
Some of the tines had to have penetrated her body more than one
So
time.
she fell on the rake more than once,
Correct.
fell on it more than twice, very likely, correct?
Based off of what I've described, I think it's likely that it is more than twice.
You provided some testimony as to the location of this incident, and I believe you called it, you correct me if I'm wrong, some sort of barn or outbuilding?
I think I called it a shed.
A shed, okay. So are you presuming that Amy Mullis was killed in the shed?
I'm not presuming that she was killed, number one, because I told you that my opinion is it's an accident. But number two, I haven't seen any information that suggests or indicates that this happened anywhere but in the shed.
Who provided the information that it would have happened in the shed?
Well, the information that I've reviewed has no information that this likely happened anywhere else. There's blood droplets
I'm
in the
asking you
shed.
who provided it. Who provided the information? Todd Mullis, right? He's the one that provided the information that she was in the shed? Isn't that right?
That is not what my opinion is. If I can complete my answer, then I can explain to you where I got the
Go ahead.
information from. Okay. So yes, there is statements from Mr. Mullis and his son about finding her in the shed. There are pictures from the deputies that went to the shed where there are blood droplets in the shed. There's no blood droplets anywhere else that are identified, and nobody, even the police reports that I read, indicated that they suspected that this happened anywhere else.
So Todd Mullis removed Amy Mullis from the scene, correct? You know that.
My understanding is that he and his son did.
And they would have put her in a car or vehicle, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Traveled for a distance,
That's my understanding, yes.
pulled over because he was told to do so by EMTs. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
So the ambulance and whoever was sent out to help her could meet on the roadside to assist, correct?
Yes, that's my understanding.
So there's no 911 call that happens from the farm. You never reviewed that, correct?
My understanding is that it happened like on the way to the, toward the hospital.
Right, en route to the hospital, correct? Or
Correct.
en route to wherever he was taking her?
Correct.
To get back to the information that you're relying on that came from Todd Mullis, he provided information as to Amy Mullis being in the barn or the shed, correct?
So I just want to be clear. Are you saying that Mr. Mullis gave me materials to review?
No.
Is that what you're asking me?
Well, you told us that you reviewed the investigation in this case, right? And that he provided statements?
Okay, that's what I just want to be clear on. So what you're asking me is his statements to the police or to the hospital or to
Right,
first
or wherever
responders,
they
whoever.
were, whatever source.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So how would you answer that question?
I'm sorry, what are you asking me about
I
then?
said, the only person that provided information as to where Amy Mullis was located was Todd Mullis and possibly Tristan, correct? They're the only other two that were at the farm.
That's my understanding, yes.
Right. So only those two people. So there's no independent confirmation of that by law enforcement or anybody else that you know of, correct?
As far as specifically finding her the way that they did, it was the two of them, correct?
Right. And his description of Amy Mullis being in the barn with the rake in her back, that is his and his alone, correct?
I believe his son also stated that.
Okay, those two, but nobody else?
That's my understanding, yes.
Did you factor into any of your opinions any information that Amy Mullis was unsteady on the day that she died?
I mean, I would say that I factored in the complaints that she had that were reported and the medications that she had and the complaints she had prior to her procedure and the fact that she had a procedure just about 4 days before that.
So what's the answer to that, that she was unsteady or that you had information that she was?
I'm saying I took all of that into consideration.
Okay. Todd Mullis also describes her that way, is that right?
I believe he described her as just coming back to helping on the farm that day because she had been staying, not working because of her procedure, and that she had complained about not feeling well in some way and was going back inside to rest.
Okay. So with regard to the amount of force that it would be needed to observe the injuries that you saw or that you also observed from Cruz's autopsy, you're claiming that those all came from an accidental fall, is that right?
Well, my determination is that the manner of death is an accident.
Maybe okay. So you were asked about pushing the rake into her back. Your testimony is that you've not seen those kinds of injuries before.
No, my testimony was that my training and experience has not identified situations where something with multiple objects on it have been able to be pushed in. That's what you were describing, right? Somebody standing and pushing into somebody's back multiple times into somebody's body at the same time.
You've seen the rake, correct?
I've seen pictures of it.
Or photos of it. You could take the rake, if you wanted to do it, and push it into somebody's back and stab them, right?
So what I said was, I do not, in my experience, you cannot do that with multiple times on a rake.
Now about the rake itself that you've seen pictures of. You could take the rake and push it into somebody's back and use it as a weapon. Isn't that correct?
Objection, Your Honor. I think this was asked and answered.
Overruled.
In my experience and in my opinion, you cannot do that.
You can't do that, but you can fall on the rake. You can't push the rake into somebody. Is that what you're telling us?
I'm saying in my experience and my training, no, you can't. But again, I am not a biomechanical engineer, so I can't answer that for you with...
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. I'll finish.
I cannot answer that for you with calculations, but I'm telling you from my training and experience, I've not seen that, and I have not I have not experienced that. And
Okay.
I do not believe that you could take multiple times and just push them into somebody intentionally.
But you can fall on the rake and that could happen.
Correct, because you're getting enough force to fall on the rake.
How about kick the rake into her back or stomp on it if they put the rake against her skin or put the rake against her back? That could happen?
So theoretically that could happen. I can't answer about the forces on that, but I've also not been presented with any information that suggests that that's what happened.
Okay. Dr. Hammmers, you indicated that you take into account the investigation, correct?
Yes.
That would include all information that's been provided to you?
Yes.
I assume if you were missing some information or you thought you were, you would request that?
If I felt like there was something out there that would help me with my analysis, I would ask for it, yes.
And information that, particularly since Todd Mullis was the suspect here, statements from him would be potentially relevant to your determination. Isn't that true?
Are you asking the ones that I had or
No,
something?
I'm just asking you in general terms. I mean, statements that he would have made about what happened would be relevant to your determination.
They could be, yes.
His motive might be part of that.
Again, it could be.
If he had a reason to kill Amy Mullis, that would be something you would factor in.
It would be, and it would be something I would factor in. It would, I would take it with the other information.
I mean, if a defendant confesses to a shooting, you might call that a homicide, or at least factor in a statement if they confessed to that type of crime. Is that right?
I would say I wouldn't necessarily call it a homicide just because of their statement, and if it didn't make sense that it could be a homicide from my autopsy, then I wouldn't call it a homicide just because somebody told me it was a homicide. I would use that as a piece of information with the rest of my examination.
And if a defendant would confess to a stabbing, that might contribute to your finding that it's a homicide. Is that correct?
Again, I wouldn't make that determination off of somebody's confession. I would make it off of the entire amount of information that I have. Again, if it didn't make sense that someone could stab that person based off of the circumstances and the set of injuries, then I wouldn't call it a homicide just because somebody was confessing to it.
And if Todd Mullis in this case made the statement that Amy was a cheating whore, or that she needed to,
I'm sorry, I apologize, Your Honor.
or that she needed to go to hell because she was a cheating whore, would you factor that in?
Objection, Your Honor.
This is evidence that was at the trial.
This is I guess the question is if. So with that understanding, I'll withdraw my question, or my objection, Your Honor.
Right. The witness may answer.
So again, I would take that into consideration as information that I would have.
Did you factor that in this case?
To my knowledge, I did not have that information.
Okay. Does that change your opinion
It
if you
does
made
not.
those statements?
It does not.
Yep, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any redirect?
Just a couple of questions, Your Honor. Wounds A through F are not stab wounds, in your opinion, is that right?
Correct.
And are your opinions in this case dependent on whether Ms. Mullis experienced the injuries that we're talking about in this case in the shed of the Mullis farm or somewhere else?
No, they're not dependent on her being in the shed.
Have you received any information that there's been any confession in this case by Todd Mullis?
I have not been given any information that indicates that Mr. Mullis stated that he intentionally harmed Amy. Mullis.
Is it your understanding there's any statement by Mr. Mullis that he intentionally or otherwise harmed her?
No, to my knowledge, I have not reviewed anything to that end.
You were asked some questions about the sort of the nature of your disagreement with Dr. Cruz and whether there's things you agree on and things you disagree on. Do you disagree with the sort of objective measurements and objective data that Dr. Cruz developed from the autopsy?
I do not.
Do you disagree with her interpretation of this autopsy?
I do.
Do you disagree with the cause and manner of death that Dr. Cruz ascribed to this autopsy? Or ascribed to Ms. Mullis's death, excuse me.
Yes, I do.
Do you is your conclusion that this was an accident, does that necessarily exclude the possibility that this was a homicide?
I mean, in the realm of all things possible, anything is possible, but we are asked and tasked with the job of reviewing all of the information and making an opinion decision about the manner of death, and what is reasonable, what is likely, and what is most likely, and matches with all of the and is consistent with all of the information that we have available.
One moment, Your Honor.
Any recross?
Nothing else.
Thank you, doctor. You may step down.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Judge, while we're waiting on schedule, I have a 3:30 matter I need to take up, so I may need to leave. I think I mentioned this maybe yesterday. Even if we don't have a break, I may just get up and leave. Is that okay with you?
It's okay with me unless you would like us to.
No, the next witness is not mine, so I'm good. So I just don't want to delay things, please. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Ms. Thompson, did you want to start your next witness, or do you want to take a short break before we do that?
What's the first preference?
Kelly, what do you want to do? Keep going? Okay, right. We can get started, it sounds like.
Sounds good.
Okay.
All right. We call Dr. Valentina Nye, Your Honor.